As it had been with Napoleonic France in the 19th century, Britain would serve as Germany's most irrepressible enemy for the first half of the 20th century. Until the reign of Victoria, the British monarchy had ruled over Hanover, and in 1945 the British had returned, occupying Hanover along with Westphalia and Holstein on the ruin of the Third Reich. History is not teleological. With the benefit of hindsight, we can observe the causes of a struggle, but it should not behoove us to say that the struggle was inevitable. Such was the attitude of Germany towards England when the Kaiserreich came into existence in Hall of Mirrors in 1871. Germany was a new creation, in the sense that it represented the national actualization of a Germanic host of micronations under the guardianship of one such nation, Prussia. The 19th century was the era of anthropology, philology, comparative linguistics, ethnography, Darwinism, and racial theory. In the context of these ideas, the Kaiserreich was not a definite end for certain aspects of budding German nationalism. It was only a half measure, a little solution. And so the logic followed that Austria, which the Prussians had just defeated, Austria with an empire, Austria with a Germanic plurality, would join the new Germany in alliance. The Prussians had also defeated the Hanoverians, even annexing Hanover outright. Under different circumstances, had a man reigned in the place of Queen Victoria, Prussia might have gone to war with England. Despite this, the logic of the new Germany towards the Austrians would apply to the English also, as fellow Germanics. The German Empire itself was such an alliance of ethnic kindreds. I titled the stream Germany's English Alliance Delusion, and the heart of that delusion rests in that sentence, that international relations are fundamentally and indissolubly predicated on the notion of kin. By extension, that no matter how sincere the attempts were to establish entente between England and Germany, we can now say that they were predicated on fatal misunderstandings. By delusion, I'm in no way saying that Germany's perception of England was entirely naive. Rather, Germany had a complex, multifaceted, at times Machiavellian, and duplicitous understanding of England's interests by the time we reached the 1930s, the principal time frame for today's discussion. An understanding that would lead the Germans in the later stages of the Second World War to conclude that the English were themselves deluded only towards the Americans. And I'm very lucky to be joined for this conversation by B. de Britannia. Hello.
Hello, AM. Great to be on the channel again, though last time I was on, I was under a different moniker.
Yes, you have undergone a metamorphosis since then from Hitman to Bede. So here we are, post Chrysalis. And Rupert August, hello.
Hello. Thanks for having me on again. I have undergone no such change.
All right, well, B will be the outlier for this discussion. So I wanted to start off, and this is a preface for the entire discussion. The main book I'm reading from is Gerwin Strobl's The Germanic Isle, Nazi Perceptions of Britain. And it's the book which I'm mainly going to be referencing today, even though I have an article which is focused on the other aspect, the antecedent to this, which is talking about Wilhelmine relations with England. But he starts off with Rosenberg. And indeed, I just want to have a second to talk about the thumbnail. I'm amazed in a way I found this image, because I think it's the perfect encapsulation of everything about the so-called alliance delusion. For people who have no idea what the image on the left is, it's a British grenadier wearing a Beefeater hat. And the whole implication is, if you're a tourist going to London, the Beefeater is completely immovable. There is no way of being able to disrupt or provoke the Beefeater soldier into action. And if you're going to look at a sort of epitome or encapsulation, personification of Britain's implacability vis-a-vis attempts at entente from the Germans, then that is the example. But walking next to the soldier is none other than Alfred Rosenberg, who was then a special envoy for Germany, who was the leading racial ideologue for the Germans, and at one time placed in charge of Anglo-German relations before he was replaced by Ribbentrop. Indeed, Ribbentrop was apparently so colourless that even the Germans were horrified by his lack of ability to win over the English. But this is where Strobl begins in the year 1935 in Halle to form a contextual understanding of the kindred relationship from the point of view of the Germans. The year 1935 marked the high point of Nazi hopes for a partnership with Britain. It was also, by fortuitous coincidence, the 250th anniversary of the birth of George Frederick Handel. The regime was not slow to recognize the political usefulness of the anniversary of Handel, or Handel, as the Germans would insist, was nicely symbolic of past Anglo-German ties, and the festivities of February 1935 in his native city of Halle clearly aimed at a wider resonance. Alfred Rosenberg, the intellectual figurehead of National Socialism, officiated. In his address, he conjured not merely the spirit of Handel, but of Shakespeare, who, he reminded his audience, had become to the Germans what Handel had become to the British. For reference, I'm assuming that people in the audience, some of you don't know who Handel is. Handel is a brilliant sort of Baroque on the eve of classical musical composer in the middle of the 18th century, who, despite being German, was mainly patronized by the English in some form or another. He contrasted Shakespeare's extraordinary impact in Germany with the more limited echo of Italian and French writers. This was before the days of the Rome-Berlin axis, and there was no need to dissemble about Italy. Shakespeare, Rosenberg explained, had helped free Germany from alien Latin convention and smoothed the path for the German dramatists. Germany had always been conscious of her debt to the bard and his native land, and had been happy to repay it in such figures as Handel or Holbein. What he's really referring to here, free of Latin convention, it's really sort of looking at the beginning of a German sort of national consciousness with Luther in the 16th century. So Shakespeare, writing 100 years later, is part of this Reformation era cultural awakening within the Protestant segments of Germany, and thereby it can be ideologically conducive to look at these figures. Indeed, when he's referring to dramatists, the most obvious, I would say, German analog to Shakespeare is Friedrich Schiller, who again is one of these writers during the height of German humanism and the budding sense of what would later become modern German nationalism. But more broadly speaking, he then goes on to say, the English language itself provided in vocabulary and grammar ample evidence of a close connection between England and Germany. This was particularly noticeable to North Germans, whose native patois seemed sometimes closer to English than to Standard High German. A journalist reporting for the SS newspaper from within the shadow of St. Paul's Cathedral in London thus found that the very street names around him reminded him of his native Hamburg and its fleet. There is, he explained, so much here that seems familiar. In the great trading cities of Hamburg and Bremen and along the North Sea, the coast where the Plattdeutsch was spoken, a corresponding sense of kinship, the cousins beyond the sea, had traditionally existed and had survived all political tensions. Indeed, I find it rather interesting, just another note, that Wilhelmshaven, that was formed under the reign of Emperor Wilhelm I of Germany. Wilhelmshaven was, of course, a Hanoverian port before it was rechristened by the Prussian monarchy. So you can say that the very existence of a deep sea port for Germany owed itself to the annexation of that British dynastic possession. Language was important in less obvious ways too. Since the mid-19th century, German philologists and their Austrian and Swiss colleagues had been conducting pioneering work into the history of European languages. It was a field they came to dominate. Teaching practice at German universities reflected this. Students of any modern language would be expected to become acquainted not just with its present-day grammar, but also medieval structure, and wherever possible, antecedents in antiquity. German undergraduates would spend an astonishing amount of time tracing the history of individual words, diligently marking vowel shifts and the modification of consonants across the centuries. It would also attempt to trace back words beyond the written work to their putative common Indo-Aryan root. This somewhat esoteric pursuit did have practical consequences. It provided a striking demonstration of the network of connections between the various European languages and the relative strengths of such ties. The notion of a Germanic family of nations was much more credible in linguistics than in recent history. Unsurprisingly, this linguistic evidence freed the imagination of nationalist minds. An encounter with scraps of extinct languages in the course of studying Old High German or indeed Old English could bring the vanished Teutonic nations of antiquity back to life. The Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Lombards, the Burgundians all reappeared after some 13 centuries of linguistic extinction to haunt the language departments of German universities. Through the university's alumni, this effect also extended to the classrooms of the country's gymnasium, and thus also into many middle-class households. Historical linguist was one of the springs that fed the Teutomania of the German Reich, both before and after the First World War. In the case of the English, it highlighted the close historical ties between Anglo-Saxon England and Northern Germany. That connection had never been in doubt. In emotional terms, it had often been unable to rival the romantic allure of the vanished Teutons of old. Throughout the 19th century, Germans have been encouraged by their poets and novelists to regard as their closest kin the Germanic nations that brought down the Roman Empire. What the alleged Ur-Germans had begun in 9 AD by defeating the Roman legions in the woods of Westphalia, their kinsmen had later completed on the shores of the Mediterranean. By Ur-Germans, he's referring to the whole idea Ur or Heimat, original home, original Germans, Hermann Arminius, the Battle of the Teutoburger Forest or the Teutoburger Wald. It's one of these primordial events, and of course, the minute you have German unification, I referenced this actually quite recently, the sort of fetishization of this period and Hermann is brought about as if Napoleon III's capture at the Battle of Sedan by the Prussians was a modern analog to that. The Goths in particular had engaged the German national imagination, from the poetry of Count von Platen at the beginning of the 19th century to the historical novels of Felix Dahn towards its end. Their memory had been celebrated. Part of the appeal was the Goths' romantic end, death in battle. Indeed, just to emphasize this, one of the main inspirations behind the Battle of Pelennor Fields in Lord of the Rings is the Battle of the Catalonian Plains between the armies of Attila the Hun and the alliance between Flavius Aetius and Theodorex. And that is where you get Theoden King in terms of the literal sort of etymological reading of it that Tolkien has. And the Rohirrim and the nation of Rohan itself is a English sort of proto-identity, which is derived from the etymology of Hengist and Horsa meaning horse. So if you're trying to find a perfect sort of analog in terms of that Gothic Anglo-Saxon Germanic association, it actually exists in Lord of the Rings. This echoed perfectly the self-conscious heroism of 19th century Germany. A solemn funeral of a fallen leader in the bed of a diverted river, or a gallant last stand against Roman treachery on the flanks of Mount Vesuvius seemed more inspirational than the survival of the Anglo-Saxons through trade and spinning of cotton. In a sense, Gothic obsession foreshadowed the Third Reich's own infatuation in the 1930s with a scarcely less mythical version of Britain. Such flights of fancy could have far-reaching consequences. In the 1890s, the discovery that the Gothic language had apparently survived in parts of the Crimean Peninsula until the 16th century, almost 1,000 years longer than had been thought, produced a sensation, not just in German linguistic circles. Its last ripples were still perceptible half a century later, when the Reich decided to settle the Crimea with German colonists with the anticipated conquest of Russia. Future generations would again think of the peninsula as Gottenland, the land of the Goths, and indeed they were going to take Sevastopol and rename it to Theodoricshafen, Theodoric's port, after King Theodoric himself.
It's also curious quickly.
I want to invite you in because I've been talking for a very long time, and always the assumption is that I would like people to interrupt me. So Rupert, please go ahead.
Yes. Yeah, sorry, just quickly. It's also curious as well in tying these two things together that there was the the colony of Nova Anglia in southern Crimea as well, which, not in exactly the same area, but existed around the same time and might have even been contemporaneous. I'm not entirely sure.
In terms of contemporaneous, the sort of period we're talking about is around the 11th and the 12th centuries. So just after the Battle of Hastings. And the fascinating thing about that is that the Anglo-Saxons then go off to perform part of the Varangian Guard, only to be incinerated by the Normans in their campaigns against Robegiscar and the Normans. So yes, a lot of things that all of these associations were obvious to people trying to find a linguistic and a racial necessity for a fraternity of these nations. Imperial Germany's collapse at the end of the First World War had not necessarily dimmed the appeal of Teutonic antiquity, but it did encourage a reassessment of the Anglo-Saxons. For unlike the Goths, the Vandals, the English had survived, their empire was intact, and had just helped inflict a traumatic defeat on Germany. It was much more difficult in 1919 than it had been a few years earlier to dismiss England as a mere, and I love this term, Manchester Sturm, a nation which, like the eponymous city, was motivated solely by economic gain. I think it's ironic here, the whole notion of reducing England to Manchester Sturm, the state of Manchester, because one of the great sort of, you can say, historical heroes of Manchester is none other than Joseph Chamberlain, who was also an advocate for a German alliance later on, but that's neither here nor there, really. As late as 1950, yeah, sorry.
So I thought Chamberlain was in Birmingham, not Manchester.
Yes, sorry, you're correct. Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, that was just me having a brain sort of aneurysm or something there. Thank you for correcting me. That would have been terrible to leave in. As late as 1915, the philosopher historian Werner Sombart felt able to characterize the English as a soulless race of tradesmen, wholly deficient in Germanic heroism. 4.5 years of war, unbroken British resolve in the face of U-boats, poison gas, zeppelins, and Gotha bombers had challenged such assumptions. Germany entered the war certain of only one thing, that it had misjudged Britain. But before we get back to the post-Wilhelmine, the post-Reich period, it will be really instructive, I think, to preface this conversation with the first doomed attempt at an alliance, which was an alliance between Wilhelmine Germany and Britain before the First World War, because there are many, I would say, lingering themes that carry over afterwards, even though, as has been alluded to here, there was a serious overestimation of the German character and German heroism vis-a-vis the capacity of the Brits. But before I go on and talk specifically about the alliance talks between 1898 or 1901, do either of you have anything to comment on that overall assessment about the cultural kindredness?
In that passage, it's very interesting. You mentioned all about having these romantic notions of we're going to revive the Goths and all of the ancient Germanic peoples, and it leans into something I was looking into the other week on my channel. I did the stream looking into the origins of the Conservative Revolution in Germany, which is this sort of block of the intellectual right in the 1920s and early 30s, and ultimately that was the culmination of this sort of dialectic in German nationalism between Romanticism and anti-Romanticism. And what you said there, it seems to be that Rosenberg, or at least his idea of politics, seems to be very much on the romantic side than the anti-romantic side.
Just to preface, the beginning was an address given by Rosenberg at Halle, whereas this is a broad sort of overview of a whole collection of German thinkers and a whole stream of thought actually preceding that up until about the sort of early 1920s. So it's again hard to sort of, I would like actually to ask you, can you briefly define what you mean by those terms that you just brought up for the sake of the audience?
Oh, sorry, Romanticism.
Romanticism in the way that you were implying, like anti-romantic or romantic ideals in general, just as it specifically sort of appears. Obviously, we can have a loose definition of what romanticism here means, but what would you mean by anti and pro-romanticism?
Well, Romanticism was a movement that sort of emerged at the end of the 18th century and was sort of dominant till about 1848, and it's a movement that was it was a reaction to the Enlightenment. So it rebuked a lot of these kind of rationalistic conceptions of politics, and it believed that it believed in the idea of nature, emotion, and very much linked to the sort of burgeoning sort of romantic movement, sort of a nationalism after the French Revolution. So that's very prominent at that point, and then anti-romanticism sort of comes in afterwards in the second half of the 19th century. And I think largely it's a reaction to the failure to achieve united Germany after 1848, where it's anti-romanticism's a lot more level-headed. It's influenced by people such as Hegel, and also later people like Nietzsche, who are sort of coming to this idea, well, you can't just sort of have your head in the clouds. You need to have a more realistic understanding of what it is to be German and how to best advocate for German nationalism.
Could you give any concrete examples? Because I would say that I don't see, especially in my reading, that much of a hard demarcation point. I would say that these ideas really sort of continue, you can say, the more Machiavellian Realpolitik streak, if we're talking about German terms, and the Romantic streak don't really die throughout this entire period. They continue onwards even during the Second World War. So what examples, would Nietzsche be your sort of example of a great counter to this in terms of German nationalism?
Yes, because ultimately, because he showed skepticism towards German nationalism, even saying he thought Deutschland über alles was a nonsense, and so that was the main example I would think of. But I should clarify.
But why did he say that? I mean, Nietzsche was focused on, you can say, to really summarize, it's the whole aristocracy of the soul. And Nietzsche was focused on, again, a sort of aristocratic revitalization or self-actualization and individualism. Whereas what you're referring to is actually his response to Wagner. And Wagner was essentially whipping up in the sort of, with the guise of Friedrich Nietzsche, in front of Friedrich Nietzsche, a sermon for the new Germany. And he believed that this new Germany was going to become more, again, to use sort of straightforward language, bigoted, prideful, and as a result of it, you can say the whole notion of the pejorative associated with folkish nationalism and the folkish movements in general, which sort of bleed into National Socialism in the 1920s. So do you think, to try and summarize your position, that Nietzsche generally was a critic of the folkish movement right about the time that it really came into existence?
I'd say that's fair, because fundamentally, Nietzsche, believes in the importance of hierarchy, and one argument you've seen against romantic nationalism is that it's leveling, it's egalitarian, so there's that element as well. Yes,
it's interesting that to people who look at Nietzsche as some sort of proto-Hitlerian, Nietzsche is not in any way that straightforward or simple. In that regard, as if his philosophy, he would sunder it by associating it with a mass cause like that of democratic German nationalism. It's quite interesting to consider. But here we are talking about the relationship. So just to preface this conversation in terms of the hard sort of political facts, Germany is united in 1871. Obviously, Britain remains neutral, doesn't go to war. There are many precedents for looking at Britain and Germany as having some sort of kindred relationship beyond the points that we've already mentioned. Obviously, the Hanoverian connection could have caused issues, but the Germans were more looking to the fact that Prussia had formed an alliance during the 7 Years' War in the 18th century, and that had been very favorable both to the English and the Prussians. The Prussians survived it after a series of horrific defeats earlier on in the war, after the miracle of Brandenburg. The two miracles of Brandenburg should be mentioned. And the British conquered Canada during that war and basically destroyed much of the French Empire. By extension, you also have that moment where it's the Prussians and the English who win the Battle of Waterloo against Napoleon. So there isn't this established animosity between the two nations. Indeed, before 1898, 1897, you have moments of you can say political cooling, like friendship and amicability between them, such as the transfer of Zanzibar by German East Africa for Helgoland, which is a small island just north of Hanover. Interestingly enough, had the British been able to hold on to that possession, it could have acted as a Gibraltar in the North Sea against Germany. But obviously, the British weren't anticipating the subsequent German naval arms buildup. So again, nothing, especially during the era of Bismarck, would you say, Rupert and Bede, that Bismarck's primary concern was to limit Britain's role in continental affairs, and the only person really to thwart Bismarck in that realm was Benjamin Disraeli during the Eastern Crisis?
May I just quickly add first, there's also an element in which, on the cultural level, there was a good deal of sort of familiarity and fondness between Britain and Germany. So what is often forgotten is that the more popular philosophical schools and the sort of predominant area of philosophical study in Britain was German idealism, like right up until pretty much the First World War. And I believe a lot of the music was seen very fondly as well. And among other areas, but I'm more familiar with the philosophy angle. And of course, you have people like Carlyle, who is a bit of a Germanophile, and he's a very popular figure in his own right, and trying to, so on both in Germany and in Britain, he's very popular and kind of seen as a bit of a bridging figure in some ways.
Yes, and Carlyle was actually, on Heroes and Hero Worship in particular, was part of the German school curriculum in the 1930s. So it was very heavily emphasized. And to further note, I mean, my interpretation of Carlyle is that he basically introduced a lot of German idealism and also Schiller into the English consciousness. So he's very important in terms of being. Yeah, sorry.
He was literally the one to translate a lot of it. So yeah.
Yes, exactly. So he's very much responsible in terms of bridging the gap between the budding sort of German romantics and the philosophical movements in the earlier part of the 19th century. And for that reason, he's part of this canon of thinkers, which represents this cross-cultural permutation. But the article I'm reading from is Paul Kennedy's The German World Policy. In 1897,
sorry, just talking of important figures, another figure that I think is worth mentioning is Houston Stuart Chamberlain, who was a British academic who spent much of his adult life living in Germany. And his most famous work is his Foundation of the 19th Century, which is very influential in a lot of German nationalism, and is particularly influential on the politics of the National Socialists, and especially because he takes a very very anti-Jewish understanding of German nationalism, and that's where a lot of that comes in. And so I think he helped give the Germans a positive impression of the British essentially too.
I was waiting for the right moment to bring him in, actually, because I think he's a very important figure to bring up, especially in terms of Rosenberg as well, which is curious because Rosenberg's main what would you call it, magnum opus was attempting to write a direct sequel to Foundations of the 19th Century, and Chamberlain himself is kind of one of these popularizing figures for the Volkisch movement, and he brought it to to Kaiser Wilhelm II himself. So after writing Foundations of the 19th Century, he basically became a close friend to Wilhelm II, and during the course of World War I, I believe he was also the most read figure in Germany. So there's loads of different things. He was very important in the Beirut crisis as well, I believe, and kind of gave Wagner even more of a direct Volkisch kind of political tinge to it. And he was also a figure that was important, very optically important, certainly, as kind of being seen to pass the baton to Hitler later on, and treating Hitler as his kind of successor, because he died, I think, early in the 1930s. So yeah, very, very important figure. And despite all of that influence in the ideological sphere of Germany, yes, he was completely English.
Yes, and despite his Englishness, the Germans tried to claim him as only pseudo-English in that regard. Indeed, he was not only a member of the Bayreuth Circle, he was actually, you can say, the patron of a intellectual clique around Cosima Wagner, the widow of Richard Wagner. And for that reason, you can say the association between Chamberlain and Cosima is actually the part of the reason why quite a few people shun Bayreuth even today for ideological reasons. You're completely correct. Sorry.
I believe he even married Wagner's daughter.
Yes, I'm trying to remember. Yeah. But no, the sequel you're also alluding to regarding Rosenberg is the myth of the 20th century. I mean, Rosenberg wrote many sort of books in the earlier part of the 1920s, and I think his influence and vis-a-vis the extension of Chamberlain's influence really can't be overstated. That and the fact that Rosenberg was a constituent of the Ostdeutsche, which, again, for anyone trying to understand the sort of direction of the drive towards the east, Drang nach Osten, Rosenberg has formed so much of the intellectual impetus behind it, even though for some reason he seems to be sort of I wouldn't necessarily say relegated, but I think people with only a cursory understanding of German nationalism in the 1920s onwards don't tend to consider Rosenberg compared to the other charismatic German ideologues. But anyway, get to this article, because this article, in contrast to the cultural and philosophical elements, really focuses on the foreign policy aspects, because I think we all need to temper our conversation with, hard sort of political realism versus romanticism. I think it's the to and fro between these extremes which is going to really justify the existence of this conversation. In 1897, German internal and foreign policy took a decisive turn, the significance of which has perhaps only recently been fully appreciated. For in that year, the personal rule of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the men of that personal rule, maneuvered themselves into key positions of state. Although the move was partially obscured by the retention of the old and weak Prince Hohenlohe as Chancellor, Bülow was Foreign Minister, Tirpitz was Naval Secretary, and Michel was Prussian Minister of Finance and Vice President of the Council of Ministers, Wilhelm possessed the politicians he needed to assist his ambition of playing a leading role in world affairs, of constructing an enormous battle fleet, of creating internal unity, stabilization of the political status quo. It's quite interesting. Obviously, Wilhelm II becomes Kaiser in the year 1888, which is 9 years before this, so he's around the age of 40 now. And Bismarck had dominated German politics up to then, presenting himself as the honors broker of the continent. It actually, as part of this whole notion of internal consolidation of foreign affairs, Bismarck had actually been responsible for the creation of a German overseas empire, even though it ran against essentially his own conception of foreign policy, which was to be entirely centered in the European affairs, to the point that having international attachments all across the world would seriously complicate that view. But it was this springboard that Wilhelm II used essentially to dismiss him in 1890, alongside a whole coterie of anti-Bismarckian foreign policy apparatchiks, and to embark upon this new contrasting policy of Weltpolitik, to exploit what you can say was a rather incidental factor of Bismarck's original policy, which were the colonies. The country was directed towards the twin aims of reaction at home and an extravagant expansionist policy abroad. Although this provided a short-term solution by avoiding a potential coup d'etat contemplated by the Kaiser, it served to postpone rather than solve internal problems of post-Bismarckian Germany. Moreover, it created enormous difficulties in the field of foreign and naval policy. Indeed, as foreign policy bleeding into domestic policy, the Kaiser was in many ways limited in his authority by having to have some form of deference to the Reichstag, and also deference to a whole ministerial makeup that was the legacy of the chancellorship that Bismarck had built. Hence why he would even contemplate the idea of a self-coup if he was already Kaiser. Michel's tasks were to supervise the government policy of satisfying the demands of landowners, industrialists, uniting them under the crown, at the same time joining with them in a combined effort to arrest the speed of social democracy, liberalism, and parliamentary government. Again, it's this very well-trod understanding, especially coming to the First World War, that conflict was in some ways inevitable as a result of, again, trying to waylay or redirect the domestic sort of forces which were contrary to Kaiserism or Wilhelmine Germany. And again, such themes essentially that foreign policy objectives are there to win domestic political battles is obviously going to be a major part of the aggrandizing of National Socialism in the 30s. Objections to the swing to the right and the development of a form of Caesarism were anticipated. The Kaiser was already the object of criticism as a result of his rash and anti-liberal utterances. On the other hand, an alliance of the crown, aristocrats, landowners, industrialists were form a check against the alarming growth of the Social Democratic Party. Unfortunately for these schemes, elections continued to return a majority of representatives from parties that could not be absolutely relied upon. Consequently, it became the fixed determination of the Kaiser, protecting the entourage, to boost the popularity of their master, build the nation together, stifle opposition, embarking on an adventurous naval and foreign policy campaign. In other words, they planned to export internal tensions of the Reich to capture the support of the masses. The people's enthusiasm for such a course was reckoned would propel the formal parties in the Reichstag willy-nilly into accepting this development. Furthermore, not only did they hope to cement the nation by this policy of colonial and naval expansion, but they would also satisfy William's cravings for world glory and renown. However, these decisions led them ineluctably to adopt an anti-British posture. Indeed, part of the creation of an imperial fleet, you can say the fleet itself is a pure manifestation of German nationalism. I've already demonstrated that the German sort of naval establishment was actually built on the ruins of the old kingdom of Hanover, which had been in dynastic union with Britain. But it was to be the Kaiser's creation, and the Kaiser not just as King of Prussia, but as Emperor of Germany. And as, therefore, it was something that all of the German states under their Kaiser could contribute to, it could itself be a symbol of this new imperial Germany, as opposed to simply relying on the vaunted land continental power of the Prussian army that preceded it. And indeed, as a personal political constituency, as well as a military constituency of the Kaiser, the High Seas Fleet, again, would be a tool to be used against domestic opposition. All these aspects are clearly revealed in the naval policy of Wilhelmine Germany. The first Navy law of 1898 was recognized by Tirpitz as being the best possible weapon against educated and uneducated social democrats, and by Bülow as benefiting the person of our dear Kaiser. The fleet's historical connections to liberalism and national unity were repeatedly stressed by a superbly organized government-supported propaganda campaign. Moreover, and this was most important, it was not to be a navy chiefly of overseas cruisers, the natural type of vessel for the protection of Germany's growing foreign trade, but of a large number of battleships based mainly in the North Sea. Why? Not merely because the Kaiser's enthusiasm for the general acceptance of Mahan's views on the importance of the battle fleet, this being Mahan and the influence of sea power upon the development of nations, especially the development of the 18th and very early 19th century fleets. Actually, no, beginning before then, the 17th century, which was so. Sorry,
just quickly, emphasizing that you would go in for a decisive battle and then exploit that after the fact. So you have a very strong central naval force that seeks out the direct confrontation that will be the decisive blow, and then exploit afterwards.
Yes, this is the decisive battle doctrine. Harness all your forces in a single location, break the monopoly of essentially naval dominance that Britain supposedly possessed at that time, and as a result, be able to consider the implications of the Weltpolitik that would follow from that. Mahan's views on the importance of the battle fleet, not merely because of these were the most splendid looking type of warships, again, these being sort of very critical, you can say, of the superficial elements that would draw a rather sort of dramatic personality like Kaiser Wilhelm towards the construction of a high seas fleet.
Yeah, this is when the dreadnoughts and the battleships as we know them are sort of first showing up, or at least not long have shown up, and it kind of reminds me a little bit of the later Luftwaffe and the association between the newest form of warfare and the newest branch, and being used to aggrandize through some amount of novelty, but also just all the optics and the general aggrandizement that comes along with that, and probably allows to give some prestige posts to allies and such to help with domestic politics.
No, I think actually that's That's a brilliant comparison because as the imperial fleet, the high seas fleet, was to be the political military symbol of the Second Reich, then obviously the Luftwaffe, as essentially the novel creation, would become that for the Third Reich. That and the fact that its leader, Hermann Goering, was considered the heir apparent to Hitler throughout the vast sort of majority length of the existence of the Third Reich. I think actually that comparison is almost one-to-one for that precise reason. That and the creation of the Luftwaffe, again, aviation sort of rising again, Germany, the Phoenix, rising out of the Depression as a symbol of the reconstruction efforts after the devastation of the Depression. All of these things would also exist with the Luftwaffe's construction. So a brilliant comparison there. Germany possessed insufficient overseas bases for the effective adoption of cruiser warfare, but chiefly it was the only weapon with which Great Britain, which always seemed to be standing in the way of Germany's attempts at colonial expansion, could be neutralized. But war was not desired. Although if it ever occurred, it was hoped that Germany would be able to hold her own in the North Sea, and the fleet was more important as a way of attracting masses and of checking Britain's opposition to German expansion. In other words, as Tirpitz was to put it, Germany required a certain measure of naval force as a political power factor. The overseas successes needed to achieve the internal aims of the German government would be hard to come by in the view of the state of the international jealousies and the fact that the larger part of the world had already been acquired by greater powers, referring to the fact that the German Empire was a relative latecomer on the world stage. Even the Dutch, by comparison, I would say, had a much more impressive overseas empire than the Germans in Dutch East Indies, which is now modern-day Indonesia, especially in terms of the resources that the Dutch could extract from Java in particular and Sumatra.
Yeah, I was going to say much more profitable at that, for one thing as well.
Thus, the colonies Germany required for her bursting population as markets for her overproductive industries, sources of raw materials, and as symbols of her world power would simply have to be taken from other nations. So the Pan-Germans asserted publicly, and members of the German government believed secretly. By Pan-Germans, he's not really elaborating on that, but Pan-Germanism, of course, is this broader phenomenon which you then extend it to become Pan-Germanic in general. But by Pan-Germans, within this time period, as we're talking about folkish movements indeed, and you reference sort of Nietzsche and democracy earlier, Bede, it's this whole notion that part of the impetus again towards grandeur in German foreign policy was in many ways attempts to harness, you can say, the grassroots nationalists, many of whom were Pan-Germans, even though I would say Pan-Germans during this time was actually more of an Austrian phenomenon than a domestic German phenomenon. However, although several German statesmen thought that Britain's century was passing, there was hardly any thought of despoiling the British Empire itself. The chief concern of the German government in the years immediately following 1897 being with China, more particularly with the colonial territories of those other dying nations with which the British would probably seek to protect from German occupation, that being the Portuguese, the Spanish, the aforementioned Dutch, and the Danish colonies. The Danish obviously have Greenland and Iceland, but they also had a tiny colony in the Gold Coast, if I remember, the Danish Gold Coast. Figures so often in Berlin's memoranda and calculations in this period. Again, this is, you can say this article is quite old. It's sort of written at the sort of height of Fisher mania. You know, I for one believe, and you and I have talked about this recently, Bede, that Weltpolitik was a very confused and at times completely amateurish exercise. You know, for example, you and I were talking about if they wanted the Germans to really stab at the heart of the British Empire before World War One, they would have made appeals to the Rajas and the Nizam of Hyderabad in particular over the, for some reason, the Emir of Afghanistan to start an Islamic revolution. So I think, again, this whole notion that Germany was going to prey on these territories, if I'm going to find a more apt, and I would say for the sake of this conversation, a more honest example, I would say it sort of follows in the way that the Dutch during the 17th century, as part of their massive naval expansion, their commercial fleet and their market proliferation, that the Dutch were basically able to control a lot of the markets in the New World throughout the middle of the 17th century. despite the fact that the Spanish Empire still controlled the vast majority of the territories over there. Economically, they weren't in control of their colonies. Given the expansion of the German commercial fleet and German trade in general, I think if we're talking about domination, it would come in that form, other than this rote understanding that Germany was an expansionist nation. If you look to post hoc things like the September program, even though that refers to Europe, if the British stood, and again, reference on preserving the British Empire, not wanting to destroy the British Empire, again, it's a conundrum that the Germany of the 1930s is going to have to deal with, to reckon, form an understanding with the British Empire, to limit the ambitions of the British Empire, yet also for a various host of reasons, including the cultural and the racial justifications to not destroy it.
To be fair,
yeah, sorry.
In terms of the perceived threat that Germany posed, Britain was also very conscious of the demographic and economic, perhaps even more so the economic angle. So if Germany had gone down more of a commercial and economic strangulation kind of strategy, then Britain still would have been quite sensitive to that.
Yes, and this is part of the reason why the later Germans in the 1930s would see much of Britain's strength in terms of its again, trying to rival it in terms of that industrial and commercial capacity. Is the idea that Germany is trying to rival Britain during this time on too many fronts, for too many frictions basically are being caused, to the point that Entente again becomes very fraught for that exact reason. No, that's a very important observation. If the British stood still or fell back, and of course the demographics are referring to as the massive German population explosion after unification, where Germany would, and its economy, its domestic economy, would come to overtake that of Britain before the First World War. If the British stood still or fell back before the steady German demand for fresh markets, trading advantages, colonies, coaling stations, in any case, then well and good. If they did not, then some form of leverage would have to be applied. Given the delicate balance of power between Britain and the dual alliance at that time, a dual alliance referring to Prussia and Germany and Austria, a large fleet could well swing this against the former, or at least it was hoped that London would see things that way. The same imperial considerations applied in the formulation of German foreign policy. This was a field, Michael felt, where the sentiments of the nation could usually be united. Our undeniable successes in foreign policy would make a good impression in the Reichstag. Debates and political divisions would thus be moderated. It was thus to be a feature of Weltpolitik that any gains, however small, were trumpeted before the nation as a great addition to the empire and outstanding diplomatic achievement. A case in point was the acquisition of the Caroline Islands in 1899, which the navy privately thought to be worthless. In contrast, Bülow enthusiastically told the Kaiser that this gain will stimulate the people and the navy to follow your majesty further along the path of glory. The apparently determined opposition of Salisbury to German expansion, however, made the future success of their policy somewhat doubtful, and thus the fleet was to be constructed to neutralize Britain's objectives and as a tool to ensure those diplomatic gains. This was the long-term plan, concealed beneath phrases of a defensive force, the need to protect German commerce. What they're really referring to here, worthless islands, much of the German expansion during this time was actually directed in Polynesia, in the Pacific Islands, in the Solomon Islands, Kaiser Wilhelm Land, Papua New Guinea, that sort of territory. And if you're looking at this strategically, this would basically form a ring of potential naval encampments and bases around China and Japan, and also threaten Australia and envelop in many ways the Dutch colonies. So even though the actual colonies and bases that the Germans possessed were completely pitiful, the strategic locations that they could position, especially with the German concession in the Shandong Peninsula, Tsingtao, would act as a major sort of commercial nexus, especially during this time. We're talking about the Boxer Rebellion, which is where the Kaiser's infamous Hun speech comes from. It is worth noting that the German government appears to have believed that the only possible alternative to this policy, apart from conceding power to the ever-growing Social Democrats, was of frustrating by a coup d'état from above, was to expand into Europe itself. And again, I'm very cynical of that argument in terms of anything more than just dreams of trying to destroy sort of social democracy forever, even though I do concede it was a valid claim by many German nationalists, especially around the Eulenburg scandal, which is a bit later, which in many ways was instigated by one of these warmongers, von Holstein. Since naval and colonial expansion seemed far less dangerous than the European war, the former was naturally preferred. Only one fear remained, that the British would discover this plan, and Wilhelm might cause undue alarm in British government circles. The Kaiser's love-hate relationship towards England was at times to stretch even Bülow's diplomatic abilities. Again, the sort of contrast here between Weltpolitik being a naturally sort of aggressive overture and the Kaiser being the peace Kaiser. This is a contradiction that many within Germany thought that the Kaiser wanted to appeal to Britain. He wanted to make all these grand affectations. He was going to be the one sobbing and wailing as Queen Victoria, his grandmother, would die. He was the one wanting to cozy up to his uncle, King Edward Edward VII, etc., etc. Yet at the same time, there was a major political impetus towards, you can say, a Cold War existing between Britain and Germany over the need to expand abroad and to establish, again, justifications for political consolidation under Weltpolitik. Maybe the Kaiser himself wasn't even aware of the potential duplicity in this, but I think I would say that the Kaiser was in many ways sincere, that he didn't want this to lead to a protracted conflict, but many in the German Foreign Office, in particular in the German army, believed that that was inevitable.
It's a bit of a tangent, but it's curious that this kind of this line of thinking almost led to what might otherwise seem fairly inconceivable outcome of a more robust long-term German-Russian alliance, because they both had that view of trying to expand, particularly into Asia, in lieu of either domestic concessions or particular expansion into Europe for one reason or another. So, in particular, the Kaiser had given what Nicholas II had understood to be a promise of aid in the event that things went bad in 1905 against the Japanese. And I think even before then, or around the same time, Germany and Russia had been sort of on the same page when it came to trying to split up China into spheres of influence rather than allowing Britain to keep essentially total commercial dominance, roughly speaking, over the whole mainland, over the whole of the Chinese mainland. But yeah, obviously that didn't happen. Just a curious what if.
Well, no, and it's also interesting to consider sort of Germany's role in the Great Game. I mean, obviously, I dispute the term Great Game. Obviously, Bede and I have talked about this previously, but my view is that the Little Game refers to Central Asia, which in many ways wasn't as consequential. In many ways, it was more of a sort of imagined competition than anything else. The major conflict was over China and over India and over Japan in particular. And Britain's sort of greatest diplomatic achievement in that sense was being able to defeat the Russians by proxy, which exposed the limitations of the French alliance with Russia and could have potentially again forced the Russians into a friendly understanding with Germany, which the Russians ultimately didn't fall down, but the logic essentially existed that the Kaiser could have wooed the Tsar more successfully than he had been able to accomplish at Bjorko in Sweden in 1905.
Or he could have followed through with what Nicholas understood to be his promises in 1905 to come to his aid in Japan, but yeah.
Well, he couldn't have, because the whole basis of it essentially was that it would be seen to be a violation of the Russo-French alliance of 1894, because any such agreement would have hinged essentially on a parallel alliance, an aggressive alliance between Germany and Russia, which meant essentially rescinding the French alliance or compelling the French into a grander alliance, which the French would never accept.
True. Okay, that's fair.
The latter was assisted by the constant support he received from Eulenburg, ambassador in Vienna and the organizer of the 1897 changes. Eulenburg scandal. He was, you can say, the favored courtier and a sort of very prominent homosexual within these spheres, and that obviously became the object of major scandal for him and the so-called Lebensberg, the Love Mountain, around the Kaiser, which I believe essentially destroys a lot of the personal rule, because it essentially destroys the Kaiser's confidence. And then we have bizarre episodes like the Daily Telegraph affair afterwards, where the Kaiser calls the English are mad, mad as March hares. Ambassador in Vienna and the organizer of the 1897 changes by Hatzfeld and Holstein, who did not perhaps realize that German policy towards Britain was undergoing a decisive change. Pressure for colonial concessions was still, of course, to be exerted on her, as in the mid-1890s, but no longer simply to show her that she needed to ally herself with Germany, for this would so arouse the Russians that the Reich's entire security would be threatened, while a Britain allied to Germany would hardly be expected to make such concessions to the world. Moreover, destroy the raison d'etre of the fleet. It would also cause serious tensions within the political structure which Miquel and Bülow were building up, since this included many Anglophone elements. Bülow's policy was that of a free hand, a line in which he was to operate with some skill until the calculations on which it was based proved to be erroneous. He himself outlined such a dilemma of such a policy. Our fleet had to be built with an eye to English policy, and in this way it was built. My efforts in the field of international politics had to be directed to the fulfillment of that task, for two reasons. Germany had to take up an internationally independent position. We could not be guided in our decisions and acts and policy directed against England, nor might we, for the sake of England's friendship, be dependent on her. Both dangers existed, and we, more than one, were perilously imminent. In our developments as a sea power, we could not reach our goal either as an English satellite or as her antagonist. So really the ultimate sort of conclusion that he's reaching here is that the alliance towards the English, regardless of whatever the Kaiser believed, the politicians surrounding the Kaiser were seeing it as an act of supreme duplicity, that Germany needed a fleet for the aforementioned reasons, but to do so would have caused an irrevocable breach in English relations. And so overtures towards the English were essentially there to buy time for the Germans to establish the fleet and present it to the world as a fait accompli. You can interpret this as also trying to bully the English into an alliance, because giving Germany a free hand, allowing for a rejigging of the international balance of power between Germany and England, would make Germany far more valuable potentially in the future as an ally, especially if Britain were to adopt, say, for example, a hostile posture against the Russians and the French around the time of the Entente. So again, it's this notion of trying to avoid being in a position where Germany and the British, the relationship is so uneven that Germany must forever remain a supplicant in world affairs, i.e. England's satellite, or would appear to be overly antagonistic. So again, against the sort of readings of sort of necessary sort of cultural links and friendship that would engender the sense of alliance, you have that position of Realpolitik. And the reason, again, I'm lingering on this so much is because coming to the main focus of today, which is the conversation around the 1930s, because for reference, I actually believe I used to not sort of consider this an issue, but I think in terms of the actual theorists and policymakers of Britain, the creation of the fleet caused a major reassessment and a future animosity towards Germany and the potential threats, essentially building on what you brought up earlier, Rupert, about Germany being able to encroach upon Britain in too many spaces, and a German imperial fleet being able to offset a potential sort of commercial dominance for Britain into all of these different spheres. So in terms of the growing hostility, one of the decisive acts is actually the defection of David Lloyd George from the cause of pacifism to his anti-German stance from 1911 onwards. After 1911, despite the positive relationship between the German ambassador and the English diplomatic establishment, obviously I'm not going to say war was inevitable, but this is around the time of the 1812 Anglo-French Entente, which essentially ensured that England had committed to France in terms of being able to defend it in the North Sea, which for all intents and purposes was a secret alliance with France, even though it wasn't a hard alliance to commit Britain to a land army in France. it essentially protected France from Germany, from the High Seas Fleet, which was the main consideration. And again, this was 2 years before the July crisis. It was 2 years before the Belgian pretext offered itself up. But the strategic understanding, and this was mainly Churchill, it should be emphasized, was already laid to allow for the British and the French to understand essentially the damning effects in terms of their own geostrategic position posed by the High Seas Fleet.
Yeah, I think it sort of illustrates the problem with Germany's approach in that.
Sorry, 1912. If I said 1812, sorry.
Yeah, it sort of illustrates the problem with the approach that Germany has, which is that France and Russia are not trying to encroach on. Well, by and large, anyway. I mean that there are times when they are directly trying to get in the way of Britain, as we've talked about. But also the Fashoda incident was I think it was in 1898, was where Britain and France almost went to war over an area of modern-day South Sudan due to partly competing claims over the British desire for a north-south route in Africa and French desires for a west-east route. But once they got past that, France offered a lot in terms of the British strategic consideration. So their fleet was not big enough that they could realistically threaten the British mainland, and did not seem to have any interest in doing so. But could I think the general intention was that they lock down the Mediterranean, basically, and so that takes one sea out of Britain's consideration and
exactly
forces them to dilute their strength a lot less. But also, I think one of the other just quickly, one of the other big things that it does, I believe, is it stops Britain from having to worry too much about the land borders in the colonies as well, especially in Africa, because obviously then between Britain and France, you have the two main land powers in Africa. It was always going to be a secondary theatre, but it would force them to dilute their land strength a lot more. Britain, that is, and France for that matter. Whereas you don't really get that much of a benefit from having Germany on side in the colonial context.
Yes, absolutely. And that's a perfect way to sum it up. That essentially we're talking about Britain trying to limit its international commitments, Britain trying to delegate more theatres of operations to, you can basically say, subordinates in many ways, and limiting the potential choke points such as that of Fashoda in the Sudan would achieve that goal, alongside Russia in such flashpoints like the Balkans and, of course, Persia and India, which was the main sphere, and China. And so from the point of view of Britain, again, that was trying to limit its international and its imperial commitments and focus on the homeland. Germany, thereby, was the most obvious threat. But I bring up the cynicism regarding Germany's naval buildup, because it seems that the logic here is actually being reciprocated when it comes to the 1930s. And this is reading from Strobl again. There has been widespread recognition during the Weimar years that Germany's sense of kinship with Britain would not be reciprocated. The Angliston, what he's really referring to is a whole sort of coterie of sort of Anglophiles and sort of affinity within literature, and a whole sort of budding intellectual movement within Germany, in particular, have warned against exaggerated hopes in this regard. One is not free to choose one's own relations, observed the author of a well-known book about contemporary Britain in 1929. It would be unwise to expect Britain's cousins to act on the basis of the supposed moral obligations imposed by family ties. Again, going back to the folly and delusions of being able to determine a foreign policy based on kinship alone. The nationalist writer Hans Grimm, whose 1927 book, Folk ohne Raum, Nation Without Space, was highly influential among the folkish constituency, who had warned not to expect too much. In a series of essays in the mid-30s, Grimm sought to dispel illusions which he might do more harm than good. The English were always much less impressed by these ties than we were, he insisted in 1937. Grimm had lived for several years, both in Britain and South Africa, and was presumably speaking from personal experience. His sober assessment did not, however, translate into any perceptible coldness towards Britain. His motivation as a writer remained what he called our ancient German love of England. Other voices could be more ambiguous. Most German Anglican during the Weimar years insisted that amid much obvious virtue, there were also serious flaws in the British character, and these flaws, like the virtues, pointed to fundamental differences in outlook between Britons and Germans. While the Germans were a sentimental race, the British were the exact opposite, sober and cold, weighing up objects and people in the light of possible profit to be derived from them. And again, it's a really sort of a cynical reading, essentially, of the motivations, which you can say were also reflected from the German point of view for going into the First War. But yeah, sorry.
Just quickly, there's another. I mean, I guess this is not quite the right time period exactly, but some of the racial angle on this on the kinship is curious, again, from the perspective of, or perhaps ironic, and from the perspective of one of the main writers that influences particularly later Nazi thinking on this kinship is actually an American Anglo, Madison Grant.
Would you like to elaborate on that a bit?
Yes. So his book, The Passing of the Great Race, was I believe Hitler considered it his Bible, I think is how he described it. I believe it might have been the first foreign language or foreign origin book which was actually recommended by the Nazis as like recommended reading. It basically posits, it's like one of the core Nordicist texts, positing the hierarchy of races, and then even within the Caucasoids, the hierarchy of Nordics, Alpines, and Mediterraneans with different strengths and weaknesses. It's curious in context as well, because you can kind of see how Hitler himself does not, he doesn't hold it too highly. I mean, he does, but he's self-conscious about it in a certain way, and doesn't want to take it entirely, or at least solely, and wants to lean into the Volkish stuff as well, because he self-consciously identifies as an Alpine, not a Nord, particularly as an Austrian. So, and obviously his physical characteristics. So, yeah, he definitely leans more into the national element rather than the purely cross-national racial element.
Yes, to become more granular, the emphasis on the Plattdeutscher, the sort of the lowland dwellers in northern Germany, as opposed to the high sort of German culture in the south. Hitler actually refused to almost recognize himself as Austrian in the strictest sense. He actually referred to himself as Bavarian. And the reason is that Braunau am Inn, the town where he was born, is placed in a tiny little sort of pocket of territory which was Bavarian until the Bavarian War of Succession in the 1780s. So in the grand scheme of, old Austria, which also, it should be mentioned, was an outgrowth of Bavaria in many ways, he considered himself more Bavarian. He attached himself to the Berghof. In Berchtesgaden, we talk about his sort of allusions to Ludwig II, the king in the mountain, Neuschwanstein, again, one of these idols which he was particularly obsessed with. The fact that he left Austria in order to volunteer in the German Imperial Army, that he swore an oath again to the then King of Bavaria, who was King Leopold III, if I recall. It's very interesting to consider all these sort of these granular conceptions that within the concepts of, again, German nationality, Hitler had his own granular conception of how he figured into that. It's one of the reasons when I was talking about my rather provocative argument of did Germany exist, that this was on the minds of the Germans as well. I wasn't simply tackling it from the point of view of an outsider. And I referenced it actually in the introduction that I wrote for this, which is that we have a series of micronations as a host. One of the terms Wagner uses is actually a horde of tribes contained within a semi-artificial construct, which is the lesser German solution under Prussia. And as a result, the context of potential German identity was indeterminate. It could evolve in many ways, and that's where you have the folkish concepts of later the Volksgemeinschaft, or the people's community. What essentially the people were, the Deutsche, was in a state of flux. And I think Alfred Rosenberg is, again, a brilliant example of trying to define the natural extent and the destiny of this new conception of the Volksgemeinschaft.
Yes, both Grant and Chamberlain that we've discussed, or that we've mentioned prior, have similar points about Germany constituting a multiplicity of groups. So in the case of Madison Grant, it's a combination of Nordic and Alpine elements, with differing temperaments and whatever associated, and different physical qualities. And then in the case of Chamberlain, there is the Teutonic core, which is subsequently also mixed with Celts on the western side in particular, and Slavs on the eastern side. And the idea being that they took good qualities from all of them, but that they're not a single pure unified whole.
If one accepts the idea of a racially determined British ruthlessness to be at the heart of Hitler's conception of Britain after about 1923, his bizarre pronouncements over the years do begin to make much sense. Much the same goes for his foreign policy, with its otherwise puzzling contradictions. The breach of the Anglo-German naval agreement in 1935, for instance, before the ink on it was properly dry, has long been seen as evidence of his essential duplicity. How else could the illegal naval build-up be squared with the Nazis' ostensible desire for an Anglo-German rapprochement? Though there is merit in that argument, supping with Hitler did indeed require long spoons. I like that phrase. But if, like Hitler, one is convinced of Britain's own ruthlessness, a covert naval build-up would be effective insurance against later British hostility. Britain, after all, had been allied to Germany, or rather to individual German states before. He's referring to, obviously, the dynastic connections with Hanover and the alliance with Prussia. This had not stopped her from, and also the Napoleonic Wars and the Wars of Coalition, this had not stopped her from deserting these allies if British interest favoured a renversement des alliances. One of the most prominent victims of such an about term had been Hitler's chosen historical alter ego, Frederick the Great. The well-worn phrase of perfidious Albion has recognizable roots in British policy towards the constituent of Europe. Hitler's distinctive innovation was to regard past British actions not simply as evidence of Anglo-Saxon duplicity, but as essentially that of German ruthlessness. Now, again, the reason that segment is interesting is that you can read so much of Wilhelmine cynical policy build-up regarding the High Seas Fleet and actually see it in the same rationale that Hitler uses for his naval build-up between 1935 and 1939. Germany needs a fleet. Germany has to accept the fact that Britain has core strategic influence preventing Germany from having a fleet, and thereby actually appeals to potential rapprochement, again, obfuscate from the fact that Germany's motivations, again, in terms of having a free hand in Europe, which is essentially, again, part of the same rationale for Wilhelmine Germany and the Third Reich at the same time, ensures that Germany has a form of autonomy, which is guaranteed by the recreation of the fleet, even though it should be mentioned that the German fleet during the Third Reich was nothing on the level of the High Seas Fleet that we see during Wilhelmine period. There's also, again, this interesting juxtaposition that you have the natural rapprochement and alliances formed by this kindred sense of, again, what it means to be a Germanic, and this realization that Hitler sees actually quite a lot of himself in the potential of perfidious Albion, ironically. It's almost like turning the argument, the arguments against Hitler and Hitler's duplicity on its head and saying, well, essentially I'm mimicking the ruthlessness of my Teutonic rival, in the sense of the British in that regard. And that also, I think, reveals so much of German opinion more generally towards Britain's decision to go to war with Germany in the First World War.
Yeah, in many different areas, they fairly consciously try to ape the Anglo, both England and in the US as well. But yeah, I also just wanted to say quickly, it is funny that they fall into exactly the same trap that we were just discussing earlier, vis-a-vis trying to compete in the same spheres rather than offer oneself as a complementary power instead, as an alliance strategy. When, especially because they almost get it right with the Anglo-German naval treaty, and definitively trying to set a line in the sand and saying that they're not going to be a threat in that regard, and then they just bypass it anyway and try to fall into exactly the same trap.
I think it's also important, just before I invite you in, Bede, because I'm aware you haven't been able to speak in a long time, and I want to involve you more, but I think it's instinctive, again, to understand the nature of the alliance. We've been talking about entente in general, which is French, entente cordiale, friendly understanding. But in either case, the hard alliance sort of construct really never enters into this conversation in terms of the actual implications of spheres of influence, and such as we would have in the 1912 entente cordiale with France, where there is an agreement over which naval spheres one will be responsible for. With Germany and Germany's POV, it seems that the consistent object of the sort of continental policy is having a free hand in Europe, to disabuse Britain of the need to form strong continental attachments. In other words, to prevent what happened in 1914, where the British were able to get the Russians and the French to do much of the blood felling on the behalf of the British in order to achieve essentially what they would later see as their foreign policy, which was to destroy the threat to the home fleet posed by the High Seas Fleet. In the case of Germany, it seems again that Hitler's foreign policy is to allude to certain elements of this natural fraternity before we see the pivot towards Italy from 1936 towards 1938, which again, it should be mentioned, is partly as a result of Britain failing to woo the Italians and their complete inability to deal with the Abyssinian crisis successfully. Hitler is actually, as you alluded to earlier, Rupert, playing with many seemingly contradictory threads. If you're simply going to say that German foreign policy in the 1930s was entirely guided by a series of racial determinism, no, there's a huge amount of Machiavellianism, political realism going on in terms of being able to underscore some sort of elements of racial kinship and fraternity with Britain in order to achieve a free hand in Europe. But if Britain won't offer that, then appealing to non-co-ethnics who would consider to be inferior to the Germans in that regard, like appealing to the Italians. But Bede, you've been very quiet. What would you like to say?
Well, what I wanted to add really was to sort of address this idea that that there's a kinship between the Germans and the British, and the sort of counter a little bit of what the sort of Nazis and Hitler believed. There, I just want to address some of the other ideas of criticism we see from some German figures. For example, there's the economist Werner Sombart, who belonged to the historical school. During World War One, he wrote a book called Helden und Handen, or traders and heroes, and he sort of tries to show this difference where the Germans are this heroic warrior people and the British are these cynical traders and merchants, so we can't entirely trust them. And then later on, just after the war, Spengler writes his Prussianism and Socialism, and in that he contrasts the idea of the Prussian or German idea of politics and how the English do politics. And he says the core of the English political system, he says, is the worship of the individual, and he says in Prussia it's the worship of the Volk of the people. And so again, it's showing a skepticism, saying the English may be Germanic, but they have a fundamentally different view of themselves to how we view ourselves, and that's a consequence of all these centuries apart in our own nations, essentially.
It's interesting, actually. I would add the asterisk there that's actually an offshoot or a necessary byproduct of the way that Germany was united. England hasn't really had to deal with such national fragmentation and the constant threats of real invasion as opposed to fictive or potential invasion. And as a result of that, the whole German sort of collective consciousness, using that in a very loose framework, not in the sense that, a communist would understand that, engenders itself around the whole Prussian mentality, which is the spirit, again, of the 7 Years' War. We are surrounded by enemies on all sides, and part of the genius of Prussia, from the time of the Great Elector onwards, is being able to take this no man's land in Europe and be able to turn it into a highly militarized, sovereign, and effective state capable of its own self-defense, even against seemingly insurmountable odds. So within that context, and you can say a retroactive understanding of the Volksgemeinschaft, it is not surprising that Hitler would draw such romantic attachment towards Frederick the Great.
May I jump on the economic point quickly as well, actually, because something else has occurred to me in this this talk of being a complementary, not a conflicting power, which is the economic element, in that Britain wanted consistent access to what were, generally speaking, their largest markets in continental Europe. And in that sense, perhaps in the World War I context especially, it was never really going to work out, because Germany and Britain at that time had very conflicting interests in that regard. So Germany wanting to establish Mittel Europa, or some kind of customs union, to gain economic access to the markets in Europe, where Britain wanted to maintain its predominance. But the curious thing there is that...
Sorry, I'll let you finish your point.
The curious point there is that the National Socialists then don't really have that much interest in trading with other industrial powers, especially. They want to go down the path of autarky. So in theory, from that angle, they should also be complementary powers, but that kind of leads one to the conclusion more and more that it's a handful of individuals that really just mess it up. But we'll get there, I'm sure.
Very interestingly, I have a sort of segment dedicated to that exact point. But to your point about Middle Europa, again, I see it so much of the post hoc rationalization of hostilities that are born out in 1914 and 1915, because before then, the September program wasn't really in evidence. Middle Europa really is galvanized around the idea that we're hostile with Britain, and thereby we need to create a contingency to ensure a form of market dominance within continental Europe, with the assumption, of course, that Germany would win against Russia and win against France. It was planning for the future, whereas that policy didn't crystallize seriously before the First World War. I mean, this is the brainchild of Bethmann Hollweg, in particular, the Chancellor of Germany around the time of the declaration of war.
Yes, I'm aware it's a product of the war itself, not necessarily a war aim per se, but I think it was a long-running concern, and especially gaining access to some of the resources in the Low Countries, I believe, going even before and going into the war.
In particular, sort of Belgium and northern France, that sort of region.
Yes,
but again, it's important to say that these are very much after effects. The invasion of Belgium again galvanizes British opinion to realize that these are potential, greater threats and conflicts of interest that would justify Britain's intervention, especially for a moral casus belli for which it could justify the defense of Belgian self-determination against the German aggressor. There's so much, again, the intermingling of cynicism and high sort of moral claims and justifications when it comes to Britain. But continuing on with Strobl, it is perhaps worth stressing again at this point that there existed a fundamental difference between Hitler and most traditional German thought on the subject of Britain. That difference was rooted precisely in the perceived racial origin of British foreign policy. Unlike many of his adopted countrymen, Hitler never expected Britain to act out of a shared sense of Germanic origins. In Weltpolitik, he insisted in his unpublished second book, Family Ties Play No Part for the British. Britain would only act out of self-interest, and she would only treat as an equal a nation that matched her own self-assurance and apparent absence of scruples. Whichever way one approaches Hitler's argument, one finds it at its base a concept of British ruthlessness. That this was based on a misreading of British history and an ignorance of British political culture is essentially irrelevant. Again, that's his conclusion. I would push back and say that the whole notion of perfidious Albion is a recurring theme if you look at British history. I think part of the shock that the Germans realized, because part of what you were really getting at with Middle Europa and the drive into Belgium and resource extraction in continental markets and excluding Britain and all that, you can say again is the rationale behind Britain. We found ourselves in a war where Britain has basically, in many ways, facilitated a conflict using the greatest continental powers against us. Now we need to build up contingencies. And I think the shock and the whole sort of recontextualization of thinking towards Britain as a peripheral concern or almost a military irrelevance has to, again, configure that radical switch in allegiances, essentially. And as a result of it, you can understand from the German point of view how, given this anticipation of ethnic fraternity, the switch would justify this perception of ruthlessness from the point of view of Britain. Because again, just to emphasize, an argument has been made that the British were essentially celebrating when Edward Grey had been able to dissemble and potentially keep France out of the conflict during the height of the quote-unquote July crisis, because it would mean that Germany and Russia would get into a war with each other that wouldn't directly threaten Britain on the naval front or the land front. And as a result, Britain's two great rivals would just be felling each other, essentially what we would have in Ukraine today with Russia, but on a far larger and more horrific scale. The fact that the British would essentially want an outcome again would only exhibit the sheer ruthlessness and complete lack of humanity coming out of the British Foreign Office. Again, it's not a view that I would say was the pervading view among the British Foreign Office, but it was definitely a view that Russia and Germany were going to become too powerful, and there had to be this dressing down, this cutting down of the two world empires, and the best way to do that would be to foment a conflict between Germany and Russia, which is exactly what occurred. What mattered was that Hitler's view contained an internal logic and did seem able to explain British foreign policy towards Germany during the interwar years. If Britain did not break with France over the Ruhr in 1923, for example, that was because the value of German friendship did not outweigh the advantages to Britain of a continued Anglo-French alliance. 1923 really is the nadir of Weimar Germany, and it's also the year that Hitler would attempt his Munich putsch. So it's therefore understandable that within that context, Hitler would view Britain as favoring an alliance with France. Events after 1933, of course, merely conspired to prove Hitler's point. Having refused to treat disarmed Weimar Republic as an equal, rightly so in Hitler's mind, Britain promptly started to woo the more aggressive Third Reich. And the more threatening German conduct became, the more anxious Britain seemed to accommodate Germany. What he's referring to there, of course, is the policy of appeasement. And I would say it's actually very revealing in terms of the moral bankruptcy of the post-Versailles, the post-Paris Treaties order, because Germany had undergone a political revolution in 1918 in terms of getting rid of the Kaiser, establishing a republic, and having a social democrat, in this case it would be Ebert, as chancellor. And as a result of that, the Germans expected to be treated as part of this new Wilsonian world order of the self-determination of free nations. And they weren't treated like that at all. The starvation blockade continued during the time until the consolidation of the peace in 1919. The High Seas Fleet was interned at Scapa Flow, and it was later scuttled when the British tried to seize it as a result of war bounty. So from the point of view, again, of the expectations that a democratic Germany would be an equal power to the West, that this was essentially an ideological conflict. And part of the reason for the Americans to get in the war in the first place was the so-called idea of a peace without victors. Having all of those notions essentially dispelled lends to Hitler's notion that the British did not care about any of these things. The British were only concerned, as a result of their inherent ruthlessness, a Germanic ruthlessness, with strength. And so the Third Reich, even though it was, again, ostensibly completely and utterly ideologically hostile to Britain, would actually be far more conducive an ally due to that apparent strength. Again, it's a very sort of cynical reading of it, but it does have its own logic if you're going to treat Britain as entirely without scruples, which Hitler did.
Well, it's interesting from the perspective of how the British viewed earlier expansion under the National Socialists, because, as I understand it, they did take the view that under the stated values of the the League of Nations and the Wilsonian order, they couldn't deny Germany from integrating other Germans who wanted to be part of Germany.
The most extreme example of this, of course, is so-called German Austria. And,
Yes.
and this is the issue you have. You have German Austria, national self-determination. The Germans within Czechoslovakia and Austria want to become part of the new Germany, and in Italy, it should be mentioned. But then you have the realism of French foreign policy goals that will not countenance Germany becoming more powerful as a result of the end of the conflict. And as a result, it baked into the very sort of core of the Versailles treaties is this necessity of maintaining French potential hegemony in Europe. And as a result, the entirety of the whole sort of Eastern European border system around the Little Entente is configured in the absence of Wilsonian aims, only to allow for a strong system of French allies.
Yes, and turning a blind eye to Polish incursions into Silesia and such.
Well, even more extreme, Romanian incursions into Hungary. Slovak sort of complete control over, northern Hungarian populations as well. The expansion of Yugoslavia. Again, the fascinating thing is that the need to establish the Little Entente and to buttress Yugoslavia in many ways came at the expense of the Italians, who again were nominally an ally, which is why they come out and say, this is the mutilated victory now. Even they had been frustrated in their so-called aspirations and what they believed to be the promises of the Treaty of London in 1915. So all of these contradictions sort of come to the fore, and Hitler simply believes that this is evidence of the way to treat Britain is simply to manifest itself within strength, which again is the same Wilhelmine argument, which is that once Germany has established itself as a naval power through possible dissembling and duplicity, Britain will have to treat Germany differently. But alas, Britain came to the absolutely sort of opposite conclusion of that. The outbreak of war in 1939 did not really shatter this view either. It merely suggested an initial British miscalculation. This is from the point of view of the Germans. Time would put that right. With German armies in control of the continent from the Atlantic to the Ukraine, Britain could not go on ignoring Germany indefinitely. Or, to put in Hitler's own words, we're getting a better press these days. The corollary of this, however, was the constant need to keep earning the better press. The best way to maintain British respect now that it had been won, Hitler thought in 1942, might be to start stringing up British officers. A minor bloodbath, preferably of titled officers, would concentrate minds in London wonderfully. It is an appropriately chilling reminder that the Nazi idée fixe tended to have consequences. Again, it's just the sort of the logical rationale that the more extreme and barbaric you are, the more sort of respect you encounter in terms of your foes and opposition. Again, it's almost like returning to the migration period of German kingdoms and talking about Theodoric the Great and Clovis. I think in terms of that, the whole bedrock of the rules-based international order and the Geneva Conventions and the protocols of The Hague and all of that are being undone in order to show purely manifest this horror of racially determined foreign policy in that way.
And it's also interesting because going back to Nietzsche, there's a quote of his where he says something like, "We Germans are the ones who are still closest to barbarism," and also this sort of channels, what Wilhelm did with the Hun speech.
Yes, we must be. I forget the exact words, but it's something along the lines of "we must be uncompromising and strike fast, strike hard, unrelenting, uncompromising, like the Hun." Interestingly enough, that segment of the speech was actually omitted from the Foreign Office correspondence, but of course it was still captured, and then the Hun became a derogative for Germans going forward, interestingly enough. And the Kaiser had not only given the British that propaganda card, but he had also in many ways ruined his reputation by it, even though the Kaiser was in many ways a dove compared to the advisors that he was surrounded by. Hence the sort of notion that the peace Kaiser, I don't want this war. completely opposite in terms of his romantic attachments to Britain compared to the sort of racial realpolitik that has been exhibited by Hitler here. Nazi celebrations of Germanic kinship with the English cousins are therefore not all they seem. Britain's political, economic, and military successes left a deep impression among the German right after the First World War. That sense of reluctant admiration took hold amid profound and widespread German ignorance of British politics, national life, and wider history. Britain's success, however, was not just in striking contrast to German decline. It also contradicted earlier Wilhelmine notions about Britain. By the earlier years of the Weimar Republic, this contrast could no longer be ignored. There now existed what the Germans called a Erklärungsbedarf, a need for an explanation. Since the political right viewed the world increasingly in folkish terms, as the century progressed, that explanation was always likely to be cast in folkish terms. Hans Gutter's duty to do so was with his Nordic theory. He was one of the great sort of National Socialist ideologues. Gunther provided little actual detail about Britain, but critically, his work connected with an existing awareness of cultural and linguistic ties. Thus, North German connection had been substantially questioned in the intellectual mainstream of the Weimar Republic. Operating outside of academic respectability, Gunther was able to re-establish it and adapt it for the needs of the folkish right. The key was Britain's alleged ruthlessness, which, according to Gunther, was rooted in the country's Germanic origins. Germany, on the other hand, had lost that vital part of its racial inheritance and needed to recover it. This accorded perfectly with Hitler's own political beliefs, which were taking shape at about the same time. This, in turn, would guarantee Gunther a wide audience in the 1930s. Again, it's this bizarre paradox that Germany, during the Wilhelmine era, with the success of German armed forces in the 1860s, is associated with glory and heroism in battle. That's part of the, you can say, genius of the political program of Bismarck, was able to establish in peace a German empire with a legacy of glory. But that legacy of glory did not translate in the First World War to a necessary impetus for the so-called Totalenkrieg, the final victory, the total war. Even though I don't believe that's true at all. If you look at the coup by the military high command in the beginning of 1917 by von Ludendorff, which basically had Hindenburg supplant the Kaiser as chief of state of Germany and director of the war effort, there was a serious attempt to direct all resources of Germany in order to win the war, and also using all potential means, such as the SEAL train, to send Lenin and the Bolshevik Party to Petrograd to facilitate the second revolution within Russia. That and the U-boat campaign, obviously the Zeppelin campaign. What I think he simply sort of here sort of justifies the distinctiveness between Britain and Germany is not necessarily the will in actuality, but the means to be able to enact that will. Britain had the naval blockade, and the naval blockade was far more devastating to Germany than the U-boat campaign and the Zeppelin campaign could ever be towards Britain. And if anything, it's not just the aspect of ruthlessness, but you can say helplessness that Germany felt during World War I, and as a result of that interim period between the formation of the Republic and the signing of the treaties, that complete passivity that would lead, again, this notion that Germany was just a satellite to Britain, and thereby Germany needed to own Britain within its own sphere of ruthlessness in that regard. Again, it's quite an interesting argument, but just sort of speaking broadly in terms of Hans Gutter and being able to, you can say, really try and racially unpick Britain from a point of view which would be consistent with German ideologues. By the way, 1999 Duke, if you feel it necessary, I mean, you are a mod. If there's any Fed posting in the chat, do feel free to mute people. Obviously, I can't deliver this lecture and be, modding the chat section entirely. But I want to go back to this earlier term which was referenced, which is the Manchester Sturm, the the sort of dominant state of Manchester, one of the ways essentially to distinguish aspects of foreign policy within Britain from Germany's point of view was to say that, okay, well, so much of Britain's foreign policy is a consequence of Jewish perversion of Britain's national interest, which would ensure the hostility between the Nordic races. As a result of that, there was actually an emphasis on placing the farmlands and the countryside as these great exemplars of that Nordic spirit within Britain. And this was contrasted with the Manchester Sturm, the domination of industry and commerce, with the so-called asphalt, which is the population of the Satanic mills, the factory workers. There was actually an active demonization of the British proletariat, and saying not only were the British proletariat different to the country dwellers, the peasants, the yeomanry of England, but they were actually different racially. And it was the different racial makeup of the Satanic mills that was actually having an effect in terms of Britain's own foreign policy perversion. Again, you can look at that and sort of see it as completely absurd, but such was the, again, attempt to justify from a racial scientific point of view as to why Britain, again, would seem to be conceding aspects of its foreign policy to parts, effectively, again, which she seems to be completely irreconcilable with her interests.
Well, that's
yeah. I just want to finish this. A perfect example of this actually was the day before the Polish invasion, a SS newspaper called Das Schwarze Korps, the Black Corps, published a peacetime issue called "The Tommies," which was a song that it goes as follows: "Onward, Christian soldiers, who have naught to fear. Isaac Hall Belisha will lead you from the rear. Clad by Monty Burton, fed on lion's pies. Fight for Yiddish conquest while the Briton dies. Onward, conscript army marching on to war. We are still the old mugs that we are before." So, again, that was the sort of rationalization that when we come to the Second World War, all the impetus had been there for Entente, but it's simply as a result of, again, another form of ethnic betrayal that Britain and Germany have ended up in the same situation that they were with the First World War. Sorry, Pete.
So going back to this idea of the industrial workforce of Britain being ethnically different, at first I was thinking, I think they're stretching that. Then I had a thought. In the 19th century, as a result of the Great Famine in Ireland, thousands of Irishmen end up migrating to Britain into cities like Glasgow and Manchester. So this idea of the Manchester Sturm, it's almost like you've got the Anglo yeoman in the countryside, and then you've got like the Irish worker in Manchester. So perhaps it's not entirely inaccurate what they're saying there.
No, that's effectively the basis of their argument. And of course, who is the other figure who is completely, domestic figure, who is completely vehement and uncompromising in his absolute disdain for the Irish immigrants? What famous poet writer?
Oh yes, the good old Carlyle.
Good old Colonial, and who just happens to be on the curriculum in German textbooks, Thomas Carlyle. Yeah. So yes, that is completely correct. That assessment for the population of the asphalt and the Satanic mills.
It is also worth noting briefly that is a more general point in Nordicist thinking. So I believe Madison Grant also makes the point that, and possibly also Lothrop Stoddard, that non-Nordic populations tend to do far better in the cities. So especially Alpines tend to do much better. So they'll have a higher fertility rate for one thing, whereas the fertility of the Nordics will be severely suppressed in the city and in the industrial environment. So they're much more at home in the countryside, and that's where they thrive fundamentally. So that's not something that the Nazis themselves just sort of invented out of nowhere.
No, none of this is invented out of nowhere. I think Strobl's sort of emphasis here is that there was a current of discredited academic thinking which was able to become completely and utterly consolidated and approved by the Nazis when they came to power in 1933. Because you have to remember, as per Goebbels and the Ministry of Public Enlightenment, that the whole notion of following the mode established by Mussolini everything in culture and education had to be brought under the aegis of National Socialism. And so by contrast, the sort of, again, traditional, more conservative-leaning elements, sort of center-rightist leaning elements in academia were pushed out, and again in favor in terms of the disciples of de Gobineau and Austin Stewart Chamberlain. So yes, you're completely correct. What the Germans were essentially responding to is reinvigorating traditions that were by this time discredited in mainstream academia.
No, I don't think they were. They definitely weren't discredited at the time, especially not in somewhere like America. But
no, I mean discredited in terms of becoming discredited. You can say they were
more towards the present.
Yes, more towards the present in the 1930s. Yeah. When we're talking about the sort of height of this period, we're talking about perhaps between the 1880s and 1920s, especially in France as well, where, again, much of the thinking is essentially based on the reaction as a result of the French colonization and conquest of West Africa.
No, I think quite a lot of it actually stays relevant until, 1945, roughly, really. And even some of the wording of... I can't remember who it was. I think it was an associate of Lothrop Stoddard, made it into various UN charters and such. But he in particular fell out of favor after 1945.
Yes, I think if you're talking about the makeup of the UN Charter, and that's a different question. Yeah, I'm not going to allude to the fact that social Darwinism obviously was still a recurrent thought in many theorists throughout the 1930s and 40s, and eugenicists in general, because this isn't simply a party issue where the folkish right is simply manifesting these ideas out of nowhere, as we've been at pains to say, rather that this forms part of the intellectual bedrock of leftists and rightists and socialists writ large as well.
Yes, indeed.
Hence part of the disdain and the attempt to racially recategorize elements of the proletarian classes, not just in Britain, but generally. But
also, I just did want to try and emphasize with all this that to make it plain that this is thinking that exists, not just in Germany, but many people are also conscious of this in the US, but in our case, in Britain itself as well. So there will have been plenty of people who are concerned about this same urbanization phenomenon and how that affects how that interacts with various racial theories that were still floating around very much in the Anglo world at the time still.
Yes, I think the point I'm trying to emphasize more so is the profusion and consolidation and even sanctification of these ideas as an established core of political ideological theory, which is what happens in Germany, as opposed to part of a sort of broader academic ephemera throughout the entire West. That's the point that needs to be distinguished, because even the Italians didn't accept the same sort of rote ideological sense regarding these theories until 1938. So even within fascism, this is the sort of main distinction between National Socialism and fascism, is the attachment towards Rassenkunde, racial science. So now it's time to sort of come up with Germany and its perception towards the British Empire in general, and this is another segment from Strobl. Invoking Hitler's origin might seem a strange argument in the debate about British colonialism. The Austrian Empire, after all, was one of only a handful of European states with almost no colonial experience. But the point is that Hitler was no ordinary Austrian. He had consciously rejected his national background. He had moved to Germany. He went to great lengths not to serve in the Imperial Army of Austria. Above all, he describes Austria in Mein Kampf in terms of almost uniform contempt. What he detested particularly was the multinational ethos of the old Habsburg Empire, the fact that people from different ethnic backgrounds lived next to each other and did so much more or less as equals before the law. This provoked in him a mixture of scorn and retrospective rage. The disintegration of the Habsburg Empire seemed to him directly linked to the multinational ethos of its rulers. An empire that was prepared to blur the distinctions between Slavs and Germans was doomed to fail. Yes, the Habsburgs, essentially, if you're going to come up with a notion regarding the Habsburgs throughout history, really beginning with Charles V, it's the ruler of all is the ruler of each. the Habsburgs contain sort of within their mantra rulership of different nations, but to respect the distinctiveness of each nation. Once you get to budding sort of ethnic consciousness and nationalism in the 19th century, this effectively becomes almost irreconcilable. The core of this, you can say, exists in Bohemia and Moravia, which then becomes divided as Czechia and the Sudeten Germans, where previously we're talking about a Bohemian nationality, which wasn't so predicated upon race. And this is also the point, essentially, where you could say pan-Germanism was at its strongest in the Sudeten region, because the contrast between the Germans and the Slavs was most politically piquant during that period as well. And of course, Hitler being in Vienna again was a microcosm of all of these nationality conflicts focused in one place. So, yeah.
Incidentally, I believe National Socialism itself comes out of Czechia, Sudeten Germans.
Yes, it depends essentially how you read it, but there's an esoteric argument presented by von Kuhnhelt-Ledeen, which is actually that national German socialism was a byproduct or a reaction to the extremities of sort of Czech sort of neo-Hussitism, which is Jan Hus and proto-Protestantism in the 15th century. But to put this more manifestly, you have figures like Schonerer and the pan-Germans who wanted to convert to Protestantism and wanted to completely disassociate themselves from the Habsburgs in all ways. And to contrast that, you had the quote-unquote Habsburg Germans, the Christian socials, under their most prominent figure was actually the mayor of Vienna, Karl Lueger, who, if you're going to sort of identify him with any tradition, you can say, sort of popular sort of conservatism rather than the sort of intrinsically folkish movements of which, again, the Austrian nationalists were attached to. And that obviously is sort of the tradition that that Hitler comes out of, and also part of the reason why he comes to, again, adopt a Bavarian identity over an Austrian one.
Though, I was just going to say the Volkisch movement comes out of Austria around this kind of time as well, when you get the nationalities springing up. So, and then that becomes an export to Germany.
It should also be mentioned within Austria that this isn't uniform. The Slavs and the Bohemian crisis was the most obvious because it appeared in so many manifestations. Also, in terms of, I think the worst example of this was actually the Badeni crisis, where the Cisleitanian government tried to force bilingualism for the administration in Bohemia and Moravia, which instantly disempowered the entire German bureaucracy there. So Badeni was removed. But then you have elements like the Transylvania Germans and the Hungarian Germans more generally, who were far more attached to Magyarism and the Hungarian Crown of St. Stephen, or Transleitania, within the Austrian Empire. So the actual relationship between categories of Germans and the respective sort of national communities that found themselves is part of the idiosyncrasies regarding around the Habsburgs themselves, that they didn't think, again, in these racial terms. They were thinking, well, I am, Franz Josef, I've now been saddled with this compromise. I am the king of Hungary, and these Germans aren't loyal to me as some sort of German imperator. They're loyal to Hungary, and therefore extension loyal to its king, who I just so happen to be. So it's incredibly complicated, the relationship between the Ostdeutsche, the Sudetendeutsche, and the Austrians more generally to this overall scheme. That failure contrasted with the British Empire, which was larger in 1920 and apparently more powerful than ever, an empire which everyone knew greatly emphasized the difference between the rulers and the ruled. When, therefore, by the mid-20s, Hitler's ambitions began to focus on colonizing Russia, the British example proved to be the obvious inspiration. That this was not the case with the Germans in the 1920s, who shared neither his colonial ambitions nor his trauma about the Austrian nationality conflict, goes without saying. It was only through his dominance of the Nazi Party that he was gradually able to inject his views about a racial empire into the wider sections of German society. And again, it's not that Hitler was essentially the vehicle for this. I believe actually the main sort of person responsible for injecting these ideas was actually none other than Alfred von Rosenberg. If you're going to talk about a member of the Nazi Party and not the general sort of intellectual climate in which they arise, Alfred von Rosenberg was very early on part of the movement from the early 1920s onwards. And right at that time, he was exposing Hitler towards these ideas.
There is another inspiration, though, which I believe Hitler mentions in the form of the comparison to Manifest Destiny, which is, potentially close. I mean, you're still talking about Anglos, so fundamentally it's the same, but in that sense, from the racial perspective. But the idea of moving out into a vast frontier and clearing away the peoples therein, and then settling it as a sort of giant hinterland, I think was. I hear different ideas of what Lebensraum is or was supposed to entail, and what the specifics of it would be, because I don't think it was ever properly fully fleshed out. But that would be one of the versions of it.
Yes, the presupposition with Lebensraum and Manifest Destiny, the major difference here is that Manifest Destiny occupied a place which was, as much as, Native Americans essentially will claim that all of America is stolen land, Native Americans were only able to establish themselves on a portion, and their population was tiny. Whereas if you're going to apply Manifest Destiny to Russia, we're talking about very densely populated urban sprawling metropolises like Leningrad and Minsk and Moscow itself and Kiev and the Donbass region, all these, urban metropolises, even, where Germans themselves reside around the Volga. And so we're talking about almost complete sort of theoretical flights of fancy, ones that are appealing to sort of very broad analogies, but these are subservient to the sort of greater goal, which is the inevitable conflict between the Germans and the Slavs.
Which is kind of why I'm somewhat inclined to, as you were sort of alluding to, think that it's partly an influence, or perhaps even more so an influence of the Baltic Germans being brought back in.
Of which Rosenberg was one.
Yes.
For reference, he was born in Reval, which is modern-day Estonia. These views did, however, coalesce with the existing ambitions among right-wing Germans for territorial expansion in the East. And again, just to really reference that comparison, the Germans in the Baltic had been there since the 13th century, not just part of the Aussiedlung, but as part of the Terra Marina and the Teutonic Order. And as a result of that, the Germans formed essentially an aristocratic elite strata, which remained in place until the Russification efforts of Alexander II in the 1870s. And therefore, there was a great ethnic showdown between the Germans and the Baltic populations following the collapse of the Russian Empire in that region as part of the white movements more generally. And so, again, there's a trauma associated with that loss and supplanting of authority that the Baltic Germans had as an aristocratic upper strata in that region since the 13th century. And thereby, like with Hitler and the Austrian nationality conflicts, as a Baltic German, Rosenberg again is carrying forward that tradition into German thought. They coalesced also, sorry, I missed a bit. These views did, however, coalesce with the existing ambitions among right-wing Germans for territorial expansion in the East. They coalesced also with strong and long-standing Prussian prejudices about Poles and Lithuanians. What he's referring to there is Poles in Poznan, which is more or less about 90% Polish, as opposed to West Prussia, which is far more diffuse in terms of its Polish makeup, and Memel in East Prussia, which has got a large Lithuanian population. Yeah, they are not quite the same thing. Prussia had traditionally believed in assimilating minorities, either freely or by state pressure. A glance at a telephone directory of any Prussian city of the 20s with its endless entries of Slavs or Baltic names would prove the point. And again, this is simply indicative of the fact that Prussia expanded rapidly in the 18th century. And obviously there wasn't this Frederick II, as much as Hitler would like to claim him, wasn't this great sort of racial analog towards Hitler. Frederick II was interested in assimilating and cultivating the land, not simply by repopulating entirely with ethnic Germans. even though this again was a problem that Bismarck had to deal with as an extension of the Kulturkampf. Not only was it directed against Catholics, but Polish Catholics in particular. That tradition Hitler rejected. Instead, he advocated what he took to be the British approach: contempt for the foreign and scrupulous adherence to racial purity. The SS newspaper, The Black Corps, had concluded in its 1939 article about Britain's racial origin with John of Gaunt's This England speech. And that's going back to the War of the Roses, before then the usurpation. Few other nations, it thought, had ever achieved a comparable tone of self-regard. And by that, they're also referring to a notion where the elite, the Norman sort of Angevin, Plantagenet elite, were finally beginning to speak English. Few other nations, it thought, had ever achieved a comparable tone of self-regard, but the paper concluded in the case of Britain that it was warranted, for its racial purity was unparalleled. 6 years earlier, at the first party rally at Marche de Friefung, Alfred Rosenberg had also drawn German attention to the example of Britain. The Third Reich's new anti-Semitic policies had not been well received in Britain, but this, Rosenberg insisted, was only a temporary problem. A Germany, organized along racial lines, was a country for which the British were bound to feel sympathy for in the end. For it seems to us, Rosenberg explained, that the British Empire too is based on a racially defined claim of dominance. Again, it's almost like they're trying to appeal to a subconscious realization that the Germans, the National Socialists, they believe that they actually know the English better than they themselves will admit to. Rather, everything that the British are willing to sort of exemplify in terms of individualism, liberal democracy, the Westminster system, is all a facade. Everything is simply a dissimulation for what is ultimately a racially constructed hierarchy. And as a result of that, if the Germans themselves manifest this in, you can say, a truer sense, the British will simply drop the charade and embrace the Germans as fellow sort of ethnic cohorts in that regard. Again, it's sort of quite interesting, just flipping all the sort of ideas and implicit assumptions about Britain as a liberal democratic nation on its head, and saying, no, we're going to let you realize your real sort of racial sort of destiny and all its horrific implications.
There is a certain amount of truth to bits of it, though, in terms of, so especially thinking of the militarization and the jingoism of British society, and the militarization of the youth as something of the late sort of Victorian, early, well, more so Edwardian really period and onwards. So the Scouts were the like the archetypal cadet movement in a sense, and represents a militarization starting from an early stage. And I believe going into World War One, contrary to how it's sort of expressed now, the military of Britain was the one that had been sort of shrouded in the fewest controversies and was the most socially untouchable in terms of its image. So it's, yes, there are some curious points to draw out of that.
Oh, and,
I think sorry.
So number 4 I've had is because you mentioned earlier, AM, about this idea of the German way of war and Erich Ludendorff and total war. But it's interesting, isn't it, that you talk about, Rupert, the militarization of British society. But of course, going from this during World War One, we would for the first time, enact national conscription and have raise a mass army for the first time, and that's definitely emblematic of total war. So in a way, because of course that was largely championed by Lord Milner, who had been the leader of the National Service Action League, and of course he'd been educated in Germany, so it's funny, isn't it, that in some way we were becoming more Germanic or totalizing.
Well, there's actually
even in World War II, we mobilize, we declare total mobilization before Germany does.
There's actually a bizarre connection, which I'm happy you brought up Lord Milner, because it all relates to each other. Obviously, Cecil Rhodes and the Boy Scouts are implications, you can say, of the Germans, again, being correct in some senses to view this, because, of course, Cecil Rhodes's campaign was about, Anglo racial supremacy everywhere as a justifying cause for the empire. even if that necessarily came at the expense of other Germanics, including the Boers in South Africa. But the Germans would have been very receptive to the arguments of Cecil Rhodes, because who really parrots Caesarism through Cecil Rhodes as some form of destiny for the West? Bede.
Oswald Spengler.
Oswald Spengler, exactly, in 1917. So the Germans would have been very well acquainted with that argument and be very familiar with Cecil Rhodes for a plethora of reasons, but also through Spengler. Lord Milner is partly responsible for the creation of South Africa. So Lord Milner is in part responsible for the continuation of the further aims of the creation of South Africa, and uniting all of these nations as part of these quote unquote sort of Germanic subcreations. And by extension, Cecil Rhodes, many sort of people allude to the fact that with his restrictive franchise, that we see the beginning of quote unquote racial segregation and apartheid within South Africa during the time of Cecil Rhodes. I disagree with that notion, but nevertheless, it was very popular and has remained popular ever since. Then we go on to the fact that Lord Milner wasn't alone in his sort of advocacy towards compulsion. The man who brought in compulsion was none other than David Lloyd George. David Lloyd George, who very much was enamored of Prussian socialism. He wanted Britain to emulate certain aspects of it, and he wanted Britain to carry out the war, the ruthless sort of total war against Germany. And as a result, he earned, despite being Welsh, a huge amount of respect from Germany, and of course, who would make regular trips to the Berghof in the 1930s. None other than David Lloyd George. So
wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, nor did I actually.
So all the connections actually, if you follow these these tracks of the English sort of German sort of incest here, they all sort of bleed together. But talking of the Berghof, the aim then, as Hitler saw it, was to follow the supposed aim of the British Raj. And again, another pushback against this, because we're talking about that. The main sort of counter against this, historically, after World War I, are the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, which begin the process towards what was the anticipation of diarchy within the British Raj, which was that there would be some form of a corollary of home rule within India, where the Indians held their own elections. We're talking about the consolidation of the Indian National Congress, albeit there would be a British-staffed administration, and the viceroy would essentially retain control as the de facto sort of king of India during this time, under the purview of the Colonial Office. So there was a tendency within the British Empire towards greater representation of non-Anglo-Saxons, and the Germans seem to be deliberately ignoring that in terms of their manifestations, because they're prepared to allude to elements of the Raj which are appealing. So, for example, when they establish in April, if I remember, of 1939, the protectorate over Bohemia and Moravia, contained within the core of the Czech Republic. Now the Sudetenland had been integrated. That was purposely styled off the same relationship that the Rajas were supposed to have towards the viceroy and the Delhi Durbar towards the King Emperor himself, being George V, in the same way that the Germans would try and induce the Czechs as a subject people into the German periphery. So all of these associations were alive to the Germans, even though, especially by 1938 and the consolidation of Congress within India, India was going in a completely different direction to what the Germans assumed to be essentially the nature of the British colonial administration. And then, of course, during the Second World War and after the Second World War, this would only expand, ad nauseum throughout the entirety of the colonial network from Malaysia towards Africa. The merest glimpse at the table talks demonstrate this abundantly. What he's referring to here is that between 1941 to 1944, there were a vast sort of hosts of sort of minutes taken at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, and also from the Werewolf Lair in Berchtesgaden. And these formed, you can say, a compendium of sort of private conversations and private thoughts that Hitler expressed that were put down for a record. You could almost say, again, this is like a third book. This is a volume of published opinions and writings, and this forms part of the so-called table talk. Perhaps the most striking instance occurs during the earlier stages of the Russian campaign. Hitler's thoughts were turning to the post-World War and the task that lay ahead. The war was all but won in Hitler's mind. Now it was time to win the peace. It would be essential, and again, the assumption was that the Germans would win the war in the Soviet Union within 3 months. And really up until October of 1941, that seemed to be the case. But within, by the time you get to December, you have the Soviet counteroffensive, which is really the first strategic operational defeat suffered by the Wehrmacht in the war up until that point. It would be essential to find the right men to administer the new lands. Many Germans, alas, would lack the necessary ruthlessness. The new lands, administer the new lands, many Germans, alas, would lack the necessary ruthlessness. The solution seemed obvious. One would need to recruit men from Lower Saxony. For that, Hitler explained to his confidence, was undoubtedly the home of the ability to rule, since the English ruling class originates there. Again, the sort of bizarre logical conclusion of the affiliation with the British and the Plattdeutsche, that being men of, the sort of most equivalent national stock around Hamburg and Hanover, these men would be most conducive to act in the completely ruthless manner as the Anglo-Saxons in the administration of their empire. Again, just a sort of bizarre sort of conclusion of Rassenkunde.
And yet,
yeah.
And yet they didn't actually like the aristocracy all that much. The British aristocracy, I should say.
Yes, I'm about to get to that. There's a whole segment on sort of the Prince of Wales, because that's sort of very indicative. But you have to bear in mind, everyone listening, the Germans, the Nazis weren't so keen on the German aristocracy either. This wasn't a thing particular towards the British. The sort of mantras behind the SS and National Socialism in general was the elevation of homo novus. It was like Rommel, for example. Rommel was the National Socialist general because he wasn't part of the old Prussian Junker stock. So, generals like von Kleist and Manstein were part of this old sort of provincial Prussian German mentality. In order to sort of realize the new Germany, there were going to have to be new soldiers and a new aristocracy that was going to arise as a result of the war. And so there was also a democratic impetus, in the sense that new men from below are going to rise up and assume these positions of, ruthless government administrators.
Yeah, I believe Model was a golden boy for the same reason.
If confirmation was still required that Hitler was not a rational leader, the line of thought might serve conclusive evidence. But it's evidence also of something else. It demonstrates the belief, no less apparent, in the tableau vivant of Munich 4 years earlier, that blood does not change, that the centuries dissolve into nothingness, as the same racial encounters are endlessly repeated. Again, a cyclical sort of notion of history that one would derive from figures like de Gobineau. As for, Hitler not being a rational leader, in this regard, with the benefit of hindsight and Rassenkunde having been intellectually discredited, you can say that. But as we've been at pains to say, even going back to the overlaps between Wilhelmine Germany and the sort of prevarication and dissimulation, dissembly of Germany during the 1930s, Hitler was capable of being able to surrender certain precepts of so-called irrationality in order to achieve political aims. I think the most obvious example of this actually is in the Tyrol region. And you can also say that this is an extension of his almost irrational hate towards Viennese Austrian society, because he was prepared to concede that Tyrol, which had been German, had been populated by Germans for hundreds of years, and was part of the Austrian Empire and the Habsburg domains more generally, could be conceded to the Italians, and that the Italian alliance was worth conceding these Germans to an Italian state, which is still the situation that we have today. So again, if you're going to look at this as all racially deterministic, no, Hitler was juggling many contradictory notions simultaneously and more than prepared to surrender ideological concepts in order to achieve Machiavellian ends.
I believe that's also part of the reason why the emphasis moves to the Aryan term rather than focusing on the Nordic Germanic angle, because it was more inclusive.
Yeah, I mean, there are many other reasons for that. I mean, one theory is that the origin point of German civilization and the Holy Grail and Parsifal and all that was actually to be found in India. It was one of the purported projects of Richard Wagner. His last opera was to be Die Siegers, the Victors. And this was going to be situated in India in some sort of, pre-Hindu, Buddhist Aryan construct. So yes, there are many allusions to that, and Aryanism sort of more broadly. The contrast between Aryanism, of course, is stipulated against Semitic populations with obvious implications. It demonstrates also that Hitler had indeed been influenced over the years by Germany's Anglistan and Hans Gunther's historical linguistics. A comparison of the table talks with Hitler's Munich speeches 2 decades earlier is instructive. In 1920, he had decried the absence of the imperial instinct in Germany. There was no suggestion that the people of Lower Saxony would be an exception. When some years later he extolled in the second book the unique British aptitude for colonial rule, there was likewise silence about the Lower Saxons and their innate proconsular abilities. Proconsular, again, sort of Roman proconsuls being the ability to go out and govern provinces. But as in the case of Goebbels and Jost's moving play about Thomas Paine, Hitler welcomed information about Britain if it pandered to his hopes and various prejudices, and he clung to such incongruous knowledge with all formidable tenacity. The years after 1933 had seen the development of Germany's Anglistan, an image of Anglo-German kinship specially designed to appeal to Nazi tastes. Unsurprisingly, it left the leadership and the country unprepared for the full force of British hostility in 1939, as had been the case, as we've been at pains to say, with 1914. On some of Hitler's subordinates, the party, it began to draw not on some of Hitler's subordinates in the party, it began to dawn not long after what happened. In February of 1940, the Black Corps dismissed arguments about racial links with Britain as the platitudes of comparative linguistics. And though the paper acknowledged that the ideas of kinship had been universally popular, it changed the Reich's academics with blindness about the truth. It charged the Reich's academics with blindness about the truth. There is a rich irony in this. It is fitting that the regime's own anti-intellectual agenda should have driven Germany's academics into political conformity, and even more desperate attempts to provide the misleading information which they thought the regime wanted to hear. It is fitting that Hitler, who bypassed the Foreign Office for fear of treason among its clerics, ended up at least a victim of the treason of the professors. What he's referring to here is the fact that the German Foreign Office was the sort of the last place really to be taken over, along with the army. The Foreign Office was in many ways immune to many of the purges that took place in the 1930s. Von Neurath, in particular, had a very influential position within the German Foreign Office, and it was part again of the need to find new men to dominate the diplomatic service of Germany, which allowed for people like von Ribbentrop, who was the failed, it should be mentioned, German ambassador to England, to assume the position of foreign secretary. And in that position, he was, effectively a yes man to Hitler. He was everything Hitler wanted. Indeed, there are anecdotes regarding von Ribbentrop that the reason he was a former champagne salesman. I think he was born in Canada, and he was willing to sort of pronounce some more extreme topics than Hitler whenever he was in a conversation. There was that extremism, that radicalism that endeared Ribbentrop towards Hitler. But because of his background, Ribbentrop was absolutely despised by the rank and file clerks of the Foreign Office, who were again telling Hitler that Britain would declare war on Germany if he invaded Poland. Whereas obviously figures like Goering and Ribbentrop essentially believe that were that the case, then that would cause major implications going forward, which obviously it did. Do either of you have anything to say on that?
Just minor points, really. I was just going to say that Ribbentrop also didn't exactly ingratiate himself to Britain when he was present, just on a personal level, which is kind of one of the things I was alluding to earlier. So both Rosenberg and von Ribbentrop kind of cause various sort of like personal slights to the Britons that they come into contact with, which really doesn't help any of their attempts to have some kind of like longer running alliance.
Well, it's very indicative, isn't it, that of the emphasis and importance that the Germans placed on the English situation, that they will simultaneously hand over some of the most important ideologues and Reichsleiters in Germany to fulfill that function. Yet simultaneously, these are the least capable figures in order to actually perform diplomacy in the way that we would understand it. Von Ribbentrop, as I mentioned, Rosenberg, as I mentioned, was loathed not only by the English establishment but also by the Germans, even though again he was to fulfill this role of the ideological sort of performance that the kindredness between the Germanic populations should serve. But as for Ribbentrop, he would even engage in such ridiculous faux pas as, instead of bowing to the King George V, for example, he would perform the Nazi salute. And there's this anecdote where George V goes away and says, well, we understand that sometimes our colonial subjects will come to us and try and ingratiate themselves with their anachronistic ways or something like that. So that is such a condescending attitude, again, that the British would have towards Ribbentrop, that he was completely out of his depth, and he represented nothing more than some sort of bizarre, again, sort of curiosity for the British, rather than a major sort of diplomatic force to be reckoned with.
And another point I want to make, because obviously he was ambassador during the royal abdication crisis, and what's interesting is what he reported back to Hitler about his understanding of it, because he reports to Hitler that, this is clearly like a Zionist sort of American coup that's going on here against our interests, whereas I think that just shows a failure on his part to understand the British political system and why that crisis was precipitated ultimately.
Indeed, and on that note, the abdication crisis, we actually come to the abdication crisis and the relationship between the Germans and the Prince of Wales, later Edward VIII. Again, reading from Strobl. One of the pivotal moments in Anglo-German relations this century was undoubtedly the short reign of Edward VIII and the abdication crisis that brought it to a sudden and dramatic close. This was in the year, by the way, 1936. Indeed, the later Duke of Windsor has been associated ever since in Britain with the Nazi regime. The visit in 1937 of the Duke and Duchess to Germany and the enthusiasm with which the couple were received have damned them in British eyes as much as the Duke's apparent wartime readiness to champion an understanding with the Third Reich. What he's referencing here is, first of all, he was positioned in France as a soldier during the fall of France. And then he didn't retreat with Dunkirk, which would obviously have been a major diplomatic propaganda coup for the British had the Duke of Windsor been able to ingratiate himself after the visit by following in the footsteps and retreating with the troops. Instead, I believe he went through southern France and into Spain. And then afterwards, he proved to be a diplomatic liability for the British. So he was made the High Commissioner of the Bahamas, if I recall. But that placed him in close proximity with the Americans, with which he tried to influence the opinion of FDR not to get involved and to try and, again, mediate the conflict for the sake of peace. And again, it's these associations that have, as a result of that, you can say, damned him in terms of the Churchillian attitude towards the Germans. We shall never surrender. The whiff of treason hangs about him even in the decades after these events, and the publication of the Table Talks and the Goebbels diaries, with their elaborate praise for the man with whom an alliance would have been possible, have only deepened suspicions. In Germany, especially among those who remember the 1930s, the Duke's name retains a luminous glow, and it is not that of a man who put Germany's interests before those of his own country. There was and is no suggestion in German minds that he was a traitor, a collaborator, or an appeaser. The perception is confirmed by the private views of the leadership. The Goebbels diaries and Hitler's table talks are wholly unambiguous in that regard. When the Nazis were dealing with a useful fool, they could never quite disguise an element of contempt in their language. When they met a rogue, their words betray a shared contempt for others. There is nothing of this in the description of the Duke's conversations in Berlin, or the latter wartime recollections of his actions and opinions. Instead, there is something one comes across only very rarely in utterances by the Nazis: genuine respect, the respect felt for an equal. The Duke's motivations in all this, his perceptions of National Socialist Germany, lie outside the scope for this, and I would agree, for this conversation, because essentially it's a German attitude regarding perceptions of Britain. How he was perceived in the Third Reich, however, is central to the story of the final years and months of peace. And therefore, as we can see in the Goebbels diaries, he is rather gushing. The Duke is wonderful, a charming, likable chap, open in manner, clear in expression, with a healthy common sense approach and awareness of contemporary life and social issues. What a delight to talk to him. He responds immediately, is interested in every question. There is nothing of the snob about him. We discussed 1,000 things: the parliamentary system, social and labour issues, national and international affairs. What a shame that he is no longer king. With him, an alliance would have been possible. The Duke was deposed because he had it in him to be a king in the true sense of the word. That much is clear to me. Now more than ever, I have genuinely grown to like him in these 3 hours. What an enjoyable afternoon. A great man. What a shame. A terrible shame. It should perhaps be stressed that this is not Goebbels' usual tone. Except in his descriptions of Hitler, he rarely reaches a comparable pitch of enthusiasm anywhere in the 20 volumes of his diaries. This only increases the significance of this particular entry. The Duke of Windsor had clearly charmed his host in the propaganda ministry, and what had impressed Goebbels was evidently the man rather than merely his real or supposed political views. Goebbels would meet a string of visitors on any given day who agreed with him on all issues. They tended not to impress him, but the Duke was thought to be a Persönlichkeit, a great man. What, then, was the precise impression that the host formed of his guest? The Duke was youthful, not just in years, but in outlook, exhibited an awareness of contemporary life. The observation gains a recognizable edge once one contrasts him with other members of his family. His predecessor on the throne had viewed the world from a horse-drawn carriage. His successor would be depicted in the German press in ceremonial robes receiving feudal dues. In other words, that's referring to George VI. In other words, the Duke's modern manner alone would have recommended him to the Nazis. The Third Reich, it should be remembered, was wholly unnostalgic about Germany's recent monarchical past, and that's what I meant earlier, Rupert, when I was talking about the shared sort of animosity towards aristocracy everywhere, not just towards the British. The Duke of Windsor's obvious preference for modern dress manners had therefore struck an immediate chord in the Third Reich. Shortly after the seizure of power in Germany, Germany's main illustrated weekly, the Berliner Illustrierte Zeitung, reported a minor journalistic coup. It had been granted a brief audience by the Prince of Wales. The paper was enthusiastic about the man it encountered, as Goebbels would be 4 years later, and for similar reasons. The prince seemed simple, youthful, unaffected. There was a Boy Scout on guard duty outside the palace, as the correspondent noted, with delighted surprise. The man inside the palace was equally informal. In keeping with the paper's publishing speciality, image took precedent over text, but it did not report his firm handshake, his fluent German, with the word fluent italicized, and the fact that he claimed to have listened to a recent speech of Hitler on the radio. There was in this no suggestion that the prince actually agreed with Hitler. Politics was not the issue. What impressed the interviewer about the Prince of Wales was his general outlook. Here was a man who used modern methods to keep himself informed, who evidently possessed the necessary skills, knowledge, initiative to bypass slow-witted officialdom. That such impressions would later have contrasted in German eyes with the British government that claimed to regard Central Europe as a faraway place, and loudly boasted that it knew little about it, hardly needs pointing out. During Edward's brief reign, that impression was only enhanced. The king's visit to the destitute coal miners of South Wales created an enormous impression in Germany. It moved the country by reminding it of its own recent economic nightmare. Just as importantly, it contrasted with the apparent indifference to the suffering of the unemployed among the elected office holders in both countries. The King's visit to South Wales had once more highlighted the failure of democracy to provide even a minimum standard of living for those it claimed to represent, and it had done so as dramatically as any Hitler speech during the Depression. Hitler had subsequently vanquished unemployment in Germany. Now in Britain, there was also someone who recognized the problem, who was not too caught up in the agreeable life of London clubs or in share dealings at the stock exchange to notice the victims of what the Nazis called the system. The link between the Third Reich's concepts of modernity and its anti-capitalistic leanings will interest us later. That the Duke of Windsor brought alive that connection is of a more immediate importance. Edward VIII, it seemed, had independently reached similar conclusions about the contemporary world as the National Socialists. When, therefore, in 1937, the leadership showed the ex-king its model of housing estates, or a film about the various schemes of the German Labour Front, it did so because they saw in him a sympathiser, not a sympathiser, but a fellow social innovator. Quite simply, they remembered his visit to the Welsh valleys, and the cheers that greeted the Duke among the crowd of Germans worked in 1937 that showed that they evidently remembered it too. And again, if anything, that is not just an encapsulation of a great what if for the Germans, because reading that description, it doesn't necessarily lend itself to the idea that there would have been a natural alliance between Germany and England. I actually don't read that at all. Rather, it's actually consummately sort of bound up in these notions that we're talking about we're talking about a kindred nation. We're talking about cultural attachment and cross-permutation, intellectual attachments and cross-permutation. And in a figure like Edward VIII, who could be seen akin to many of the quote-unquote sort of Völkisch, populist, modern elements that the Reich, again, liked to associate itself with, it would simply be another barrier to be broken. In the same way that, as we've been describing, how Ribbentrop was so poorly received in Britain, that breaking down the officialdom, breaking down the labyrinthine sort of barriers of entry to the Germans in Whitehall, allowing someone with a free, easy manner who could and was willing to talk to the Germans as an equal and vice versa, could have facilitated an entente. But again, that assumes that the king would be able to exert a real influence on the British political system, as opposed to being an ornament and a decoration, which both George V and George VI were to some extent. What do you think of that assessment?
Well, I think there's an element where this idea of what if Edward VIII remained king, and there's all these alternate history interpretations how it would have led to an alliance with the Nazis, and I think that's some kind of modern boomer truth sort of hauntology that thank God that didn't happen, and you kind of see it implied a bit, but yeah, but it's interesting. It actually has a lot more nuance to Edward's character, and it's interesting as well. You talk about this idea that the Nazis had a disdain for the old German aristocracy, but describing Edward's visit there to South Wales and his concern for the condition of the workers. But it's a interesting parallel with the Kaiser, because obviously he shown similar concerns as well when he first became emperor.
Well, yes, just to sort of build upon that again, sort of a continuity here is that obviously the Kaiser had his outbursts, his dramatic outbursts, for which he's probably better known than for anything else. But when he was involved in this power struggle against Bismarck between 1888 and 1890, part of the sort of crystallizing sort of motivation behind that was over the treatment of striking workers in Westphalia, and also over the Kulturkampf, it should be mentioned. The Kaiser was willing to take a position which was, he believed, was in the spirit of pure monarchism, which is to accept the hierarchy, natural sort of hierarchy of social relations, but nevertheless to appeal to the lowest and allow them to petition the Kaiser to intercede on their behalf and thereby improve and ameliorate their situations, in the same way that the Kaiser, despite being a Prussian reformed and head of the Prussian church, could also willingly work with Prussian subjects who just so happened to be Catholic, crossing those lines in the way that Bismarck especially with his anti-socialist denaturalization laws, etc., would not countenance. So in the same way, again, the Kaiser could be seen to be a preamble to Hitler in many ways, in the sense like we see with the High Seas Fleet. Part of the fascinating thing about the Kaiser, again, is his willingness to be seen as a ruler for all Germans, and not just a Prussian sort of ornament which is attached to the political system. And I think that's also part of the exhibition behind the personal rule, the whole mantra there. I mean, if you say, for example, contrast the speech upon the declaration of war in 1914 compared to, say, for example, Franz Josef's speech at the point of view of the declaration of war, they are completely different in tone. The Kaiser is willing to show a familiarity and an appeal to the popular faction within politics, far more so than his co-monarch in Austria at that time. And I think the Germans, again, were prepared to latch onto that. The Germans were willing, the National Socialists were willing to appeal to any tradition that suited their ends. So, for example, despite their anti-monarchism, Hitler directly cultivated an air which was to draw comparisons to Ludwig II of Bavaria. The sort of the long sort of artistic, sort of long sort of suffering romantic, with a sort of healthy distance between him and the population. There was a certain aloofness that Hitler wanted to cultivate, a sort of air of an ethereal air around him that was appealing to Ludwig II. Yet also he was, by complete contrast, the avid populace who wanted to speak directly to the German nation in familiar tones, like we see with Wilhelm II. So yes, it's an important point to mention that when we're talking about German ideology, we're not talking about something as rigid as Marxism or Marxism-Leninism that we see in the Soviet Union. It is a system that is prepared to pick and choose and, again, remove sort of elements of ideological rigidity if it would come at the expense of practical power considerations. So many elements of the German aristocracy became willing Nazis. Part of the Hohenzollern partial collaboration with National Socialism is actually cited as one of the reasons by historians such as Richard Evans as to why there shouldn't be a recognition of the Prussian royal family for that exact reason. The fact that many members of certain aristocratic families were prepared to join in, become members of the SS, members of the National Socialist Party. So they were prepared to accept high-profile scalps for the sake, again, of political aims, but at the same time, they would promote the new men, the new Reichsleiters, the new Gauleiters, the new generals, who were prepared to, again, show absolute sort of tenacity and ruthlessness as part of, an ideal of what it means to be a German.
I know, certainly, and if I recall, I think it's in 1940, I can't remember the name, but there was a former prince that had actually been killed in the war, and there was a great outburst of sort of public sympathy, and so the Nazis passed a law, I think it's called the Prinzips law or something, which actually bans any former member of the German royal dynasties from serving in the armed forces.
And at the same time, they would publish a book on again, we're talking about they're attempting to racially distinguish the British proletariat from the British peasant, the British yeomanry spirit. There was also I can't remember the book off the top of my head, but there was a book published which tried to claim that the aristocracy were subhuman in the sense that they were all simply the products of incest, and thereby it was, again, a racial and genetic factor in the aristocrats of Europe that actually meant that they were actually inferior to good, honest German stock. So many seemingly contradictory elements, again, infused in National Socialism that would arise whenever it was convenient.
Going back to more the original point, I am sort of sympathetic to the idea that Edward VIII was removed for sort of political reasons more so than the actual stated reason, but the stated marriage. But I do think there's kind of potentially an element of, because we didn't really discuss it much. It's not entirely pertinent, but he was raised as a crown prince in such a way that it kind of gives the impression that he was to take a more active role in governance, perhaps, or that he was going to be a more forthright king. That's always the impression that I got anyway, and that seems to be the impression that the Nazis had of him as well, somewhat. In that he's personable and trying to have a broad base of support and be more actively involved, not just merely a figurehead. But that potentially means, it's potentially part of the downfall is because he was presenting too many threats on too many different fronts at once. So not only is he trying to guide foreign policy in some sense, but he's also trying to, stretch his elbows out a little bit, so to speak, in constitutional spheres, even if only implicitly.
Yes, I mean, there's the more realistic aim, which I think is the one I outlined, which is that he would simply be another barrier broken towards, German understanding or entente. And then there is the delusion, which is that he would willingly collaborate with the Germans and that he would also effect a royal coup within Britain in order to completely sort of dismantle the anti-German elements within it to facilitate an entente. And I think, again, depending on who you ask, the view prevaricated between the two. But you can understand from that point of view, even from those very, very modest expectations of Edward, that the abdication crisis was, I mean, in many ways, you can say, despite appeasement, it represented the final nail in the coffin for a genuine entente. Because appeasement isn't entente in the sense that, it was a friendly accommodation. Rather, it was a willingness that Britain was not prepared to fight a war with Germany at the time. We're talking sort of 1938, 1939. And obviously the same prime minister who was responsible for appeasement was also the same prime minister, lest we forget, for declaring war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939. So again, it's an interesting sort of case to bear. But I agree with you, Rupert, that I think my view has always been that the Wallace affair, the marriage affair, was always a very useful pretext. That and the fact that Edward was so resolute in that regard that he was unwilling to compromise in that matter. So in many ways, Edward was responsible for his own downfall in that regard. But at the same time, it was a complete sigh of relief for a huge strata of the British elite during that time that he was gone, and that George VI would, by extension, prove to be so pliant.
Another point that I wanted to make quickly as well is that on these points about the aristocracies, that is kind of another point that I would say sort of causes the Nazis to shoot themselves in the foot, because insofar as there is going to be a tradition or like a group that is going to be sympathetic towards, perhaps if not the substance of the National Socialist program, more so the aesthetics of it and some of the pretensions of it. And insofar as the interwar period has a kind of robust and very popular through line of authoritarianism in one form or another, especially anti-communism, in terms of anti-communism, that constituency to me lies much more in the aristocracy, the traditional landed aristocracy. But not only do the National Socialists not have any particular interest in courting that group, they also don't seem to understand the extent to which it can actually have power and throw its weight around. So, looking ahead a little bit, you have the flight of Rudolf Hess, trying to get in contact with I can't even remember his name now, a particular Scottish aristocrat who, clearly he thought had much more power to throw his weight around than even if Hess's pretensions had actually been, an understanding had actually been correct. It seems incredibly doubtful that a small clique of titled aristocrats would have been able to divert the whole British state at that point.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I'm going to present a rather sort of interesting view, but despite being nominally disempowered, I think the German aristocracy actually had more influence within the Third Reich than the British aristocracy. In some respects,
agree, actually, yes.
In some respects, that they actually had in Britain.
Yeah, so especially if you're looking at like the military and offers like Manstein or or other Prussian Junkers formerly.
Well, I think again the point about the British aristocracy is that we're talking about an imperial elite, not simply a domestic elite. It's easy to look at the British Empire and domestic politics in Westminster as one and the same thing. They're not. Britain is a heterogeneous empire. So yes, you may have, say, for example, the fact that inevitably the Viceroy of India will always be a noble or will be ennobled in order to fulfill that role. But the Viceroy of India will, with a rare exception, have very, very little influence in terms of the actual course of foreign affairs more generally. The only sort of major exception I can really think of during this time is Lord Halifax. But even Lord Halifax, in the grand scheme of things, despite being an aristocrat, was actually quite a low-ranking aristocrat in the grand scheme of things. So, yeah, if I remember being a viscount. Anyway.
Eden gets smeared as a representative of everything that the Nazis don't like about the aristocracy, seemingly. But
and the reason that is, I think it's because he was so incapable during the Abyssinian crisis. Essentially, you can say Eden's posture post the Hall-Laval Pact, which is ironic actually, considering the ditty I brought up about Hoare earlier on, was that the hostility that Eden showed towards appeasement regarding Abyssinia basically ensured that not only would Mussolini take over the entirety of Abyssinia and there'll be no compromise in that regard, but also that Mussolini would drift inexorably into the German camp as well. So, yes, many reasons why the Germans would dislike Eden for that reason. But going on to, yeah.
And why I think he's probably one of our worst modern politicians, so...
Yes, I mean, even we're talking about sort of going way ahead to the Suez Crisis. I mean, the Suez Crisis would not have occurred had Britain not already taken the preemptive step to reduce its military presence in that region. So, if anything, the Suez Crisis was a thing invited upon by the actions of Anthony Eden, who was, I believe, foreign minister throughout the entirety of both Churchill's premierships. Given such apparently modest German aims, and what again, apparently modest German aims, the formation of the Entente, we're talking about a free hand in Europe. And again, I think the inexplicable nature, I've talked about this elsewhere, what on earth does it matter if Germany takes over Poland? With Belgium, there is a far more concrete case to be made, given Britain's sort of immediate interests that are threatened there compared to the High Seas Fleet. But there is no fundamental sort of strategic interest that is sort of threatened by Poland. So it almost seems that, again, Britain blundered into the Second World War without any grander strategic aims other than simply reducing Germany in terms of its power and some pretensions, and not even really seriously achieving regime change, it should be mentioned, because the period between September of 1939 and May of 1940 was the closest Germany could have had to a regime change that was brought about by figures such as Beck and the German resistance and the Kreisau Circle, etc. But the British didn't even seriously engage with the notion of regime change either. I would almost look at Lord Halifax's foreign policy from around about April of 1939 onwards as virtually inexplicable. That in the sense that the Soviet Union also violated Polish sovereignty and carved out Poland at the same time and then invaded Finland. It was a very awkward position for Britain during the Phony War, because it seemed that the actual cause and justification towards Germany could equally be applied to the Soviet Union, and yet it wasn't. And only when you had the invasion of France did the whole sort of later sort of war mantra crystallize.
For one possible view on the Poland angle, I do think the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is actually a somewhat important piece of the puzzle, because the figures who would have otherwise been able to make a case that Germany would at least be a useful bulwark against the Soviets, who were still, towards the earlier part of this period, the arch enemy, especially for rightists. The swift alliance between the Germans and the Soviets very much just, well, not only it undercuts that case, it just completely destroys that case. And
well, you have to bear in mind the timing of that. I would agree with you had that been the case in April of 1939, but it wasn't. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a response to the British and the Polish position over the Danzig crisis, and the fact that the Polish believed that the British were sworn to uphold the territorial integrity, not just the sovereignty of Poland. And so the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed very shortly before the invasion of Poland, and also the secret protocols of it, i.e. the carving up of territory, were also obviously not made public. So yes, I would agree with you, had that occurred much earlier. But it seems from the German point of view, again, that they were essentially accepting that there would be no British sort of recontextualization of an understanding regarding that due to the failure of British foreign policy.
Well, I think...
So in that context, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was actually not only a knee-jerk reaction, but it was also a diplomatic triumph for Germany.
Well, I think, though, optically, once again, if you were in Britain looking at Germany as a possible cudgel against the Soviets, the other premier anti-Soviet power in the region at the time is Poland. And so if you have Germany and Poland willing to work together, then that represents, a genuine possibility of being able to destroy the Soviets. But through the carving up of Poland, that's siding with the Soviets against, again, the other premier most persistent anti-communist power in the region.
Again, I just don't. That view has never held any sort of value to me, because I don't see that much vehement anti-Sovietism in terms of the actual decision-making process in both France and Britain at that time. The possibility of an alliance with the Soviet Union and France was a constantly brought up topic against Germany in the 1930s. It always seemed that Germany was the principal threat for France because of the remilitarization of the Rhineland and the obvious threat that Germany posed directly to France. Hence, we see the construction of the Maginot Line. So from French national interest, it seemed that, again, enticing the Soviets into an alliance, again, was... We have issues, say, for example, with Czechoslovakia, where, again, Czechoslovakia could have been a point where the French appealed to the Soviets to form an alliance and then failed, and then followed the British line of thinking, which was to concede at the Munich Agreement. So, no, if anything, it seemed that, once again, Hitler completely and Ribbentrop completely outmaneuvered the French by essentially giving the Soviets what they wanted, but the Allies weren't in any position to concede. So the more I've looked into this and think about this, it just seems to be a complete and utter failure from the point of view of British foreign policy makers, who really didn't seem to have any coherent foreign policy towards this particular aspect. And the important point for this conversation is that was certainly the German view as well. The Germans basically saw it again, like, to perhaps even a greater extent than the First World War. If the aim is generally entente and giving Germany a free hand in Europe, then why is Britain allowed to have an empire which spans a quarter of the world, but the Germans aren't allowed to have Poland? To them, it's completely and utterly inexplicable as to why this would happen.
And well, I think an interesting argument I encountered was, I remember when I was reading Stephen Kotkin's second volume of his Stalin biography, where he was looking and trying to explain Molotov-Ribbentrop, and his essential assessment of it is that Molotov-Ribbentrop came about because the Germans and the Soviets were revisionist powers, whereas the British and the French were the sort of the traditional powers, and ultimately because Britain and France were not prepared to compromise on the Versailles settlement with either the Soviets or the Germans, the two revisionist powers came together and just revised it themselves, and that's why that happened. Yes,
but again, that view isn't convincing, because Chamberlain was prepared to concede the validity of Germany's grievances over Czechoslovakia. And the importance of Czechoslovakia really needs to be stressed, because Czechoslovakia was the bulwark for not only the French alliance in Eastern Europe, far more so than Poland, it should be mentioned, but ideologically, Czechoslovakia was modeled after the French Republic. It was a vehicle not only for French foreign policy interests, but French ideas into that region as well. As a result of that, the carving up of Czechoslovakia, by extension, Romania also fell off, despite again being in alliance with Poland, it would later join with Germany. The same with Yugoslavia. It basically set adrift all of these other alliances. So the fact that they were able to concede on that central point of issue, which, again, to focus the argument, having Prague within the Allied camp would have given the Allies striking distance within Berlin itself. So that was essential. The Germans could not realistically take over the Sudeten fortifications, which were some of the strongest in Europe outside of the Maginot Line. So the more you think about it, the more the British position seems completely and utterly inexplicable to the Germans, at least. Why were they prepared to concede all of these strategic gains to Germany only ever to force the question when it comes to Poland? It doesn't seem to make any sense. Anyway, this is quite rather tangential, but it's important because, like I said, the Germans are thinking in the same way. Again, I'm not saying that in the way that I'm becoming an apologist for the Germans. What I'm essentially saying is that from their point of view, like we're going to see with the Americans later on, the whole rationale for Britain seems self-defeating. What are they trying to achieve? What are they trying to hold up? Who is the main enemy? Is it the Soviets? Is it the Germans? What are they essentially trying to achieve? The entire alliance structure has already essentially been unraveling even before we get to the Polish guarantee. And the fact that the Polish guarantee was so ambiguous, again, it doesn't lend itself to this notion that the British, again, were going to uphold the territorial integrity of Poland. But as with everything with diplomacy, your diplomacy only matters insofar as how you are interpreted, not what your intentions are. And so the Polish believed that this was an ironclad alliance, which effectively it translated into, but only with respect to the Germans and not the Soviets. Again, the more you think about it, the more perplexing it seems and has remained since. But I'll continue on. Britain's unexpected declaration of war provided a problem for the propagandists. It needed to be explained to the German public without revealing the true extent of earlier Nazi demands. References to the malice of specific British politicians were part of the strategy. So were hints about the mental inflexibility of the age. And when they're talking about the mental inflexibility of the age, they're talking in particular about Lord Halifax. Lord Halifax in many ways was, despite again revisionists who claim that he was in some senses sympathetic towards Germany, he was the epitome of everything that the British vilified about the establishment, as had previously been afforded to Anthony Eden over Abyssinia. The Nazis' true stroke of genius, however, was to suggest that Danzig or even Poland were merely excuses for underlying British aggressiveness. The roots of the conflict were ideological. What was at issue, supposedly, was the future of capitalism itself. The Anglo-German War was, in a sense, a class war between capital and labour, the decisive struggle of Europe's revolution. It was fought by the money bags, which featured so prominently in anti-British cartoons, and targeted the toiling Aryan masses who, under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, had escaped the tyranny of gold. The war was a conflict between a British plutocracy, defending its right to exploit others at home and abroad, and a Reich whose guiding principle was the dignity of labour. It's not the German principle as such, the wish to destroy, declared the SS paper, the socialist German people. It is worth reflecting on how ingenious this line of argument was. It did much more than merely divert attention from Germany's attack on Poland. For one thing, it put the blame of the war against all evidence on Britain, and did so supposedly enabling ordinary Germans to see through the enemy propaganda. All evidence in the sense that Germany obviously attacked Poland, but ingenious in the sense that if the British reason for declaring war on Germany on Germany as a result of Poland seems inexplicable to me, then it's that, again, inexplicable nature of the reason that we are now at war as a result of some contrived nonsense over the Polish guarantee to most German people, that the argument that it's ideological and financial and economic can become so convincing. So in so many ways, again, the British are just completely and utterly defeating the point of whatever they wanted to achieve here. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, I'd say so.
The titles of anti-British books and pamphlets of the earlier years of the war reveal that strategy clearly. The recurring imagery is that of slipping masks, of Britain's true face exposed or of the truth revealed. Explaining the war in economic and social terms, moreover, referred directly to the self-image of the Third Reich. In the Nazi views of the 1930s, Germany had overcome class conflict by rejecting the capitalist system. Instead, the leadership provided an overall framework in which employees and employers were cooperating for the good of the nation. Actual ownership of a company, suggested the SS newspaper, was now completely irrelevant. The new economic order had, in the Nazi phrase, put the common interest before the individual interest. National Socialism had turned the unemployed into workers and the workers into genuine citizens. Freeing Germany from the clutches of capitalism had changed the lives of millions. Workers now enjoyed guaranteed holidays and means to travel through their fatherland like lords in conquered trousers. Cars were being designed for them, and even foreign travel on cruise ships had become possible. This is strength through joy. In a remarkable anticipation of post-war stereotypes, the SS paper suggested that here lay one of the roots of hostility to the Reich. British tourists resented having to suddenly share the beaches with Germans. After all, as the French said, égoïste comme les Anglais, such is the egoism of the English. And again, I think the more you sort of look into this whole argument, I'm going to sort of continue reading on from Strobl, but again, it provides a ideological justification and bulwark for the particular sort of nature of German National Socialism. Germany's revolution was thus profoundly unwelcome to the moneyed class in Britain. It represented a double threat at home. The working class might start to wonder why their country was unable to provide them with a standard of living Germany offered her nationals. The British Empire owned a quarter of the globe, but supposedly lacked the means to offer its workers a minimum level of comfort. Germany's example was therefore acutely dangerous and had to be destroyed at all costs. They, the British government, hate us for all our social convictions. Hitler said in 1940 at the beginning of winter relief, and our plans and actions in the social field seemed dangerous to them. Winter help in particular. Abroad, other nations might follow the Third Reich's example of autarky, which would ultimately affect the banks in the City of London and thus the lords, their interest rates. Britain's future standard of living would depend on what she was able to produce by the sweat of her brow rather than by demanding lucrative commissions. Neither thought was welcome to Britain's political class with its banking and landowning background. Lord Halifax's reported claim that the war was in defense of everything that made life worth living was therefore in propaganda terms the wrong thing for a peer of the realm to say. Again, the anti-aristocratic argument. The German press conceded gleefully that it had undeniable ring of honesty about it. It seemed to prove the Nazi point. War had been unleashed by a small, utterly irresponsible group in Britain, eager to protect their sectional interests. So yes.
It's curious. So on the economics point, it's curious that this is coming, roughly speaking, at the same time as imperial preference and a gradual move towards imperial federation. I mean, again, also curious that's one of the main projects and legacies of Joseph Chamberlain, who we brought up earlier as one of the noted Germanophiles. But the fact that this is when it kind of just implies that Germany is dealing with somewhat outdated or something like that. Either outdated information or, perhaps still dealing in stereotypes that have moved out of date because, at the same time that as they are moving away from this kind of free trade, more financialized system, is when Britain is from Germany receiving the most scorn about it.
I mean, it's a half measure. Obviously, Joseph Chamberlain fails in that endeavor. I mean, the 1906 election very famously wasn't fought over the social reforms that the Liberals would bring in. It was fought over the loaf of bread size, which was free trade, big loaf, imperial preference, small loaf. Joseph Chamberlain basically destroyed the Conservative Party and kept it out of power until Asquith sort of invites them in back in 1915, and then we have a series of governments led by liberals such as David Lloyd George, national liberals, but in many ways conservatives. But the imperial preference sort of argument comes back under Stanley Baldwin, and I believe it was in many ways kind of almost like a quirk of Stanley Baldwin, because on the one hand you have the imperial conferences between the Dominion governments, and I think this is also why the abdication crisis was so important for figures like Stanley Baldwin, because it was a demonstration of the power of the Dominion governments to also reject Edward as their king. So ironically, removing the king and getting George VI in was a means again to facilitate potential imperial federation in the future, because Edward VIII would be seen to be a liability in that regard because he was too colourful. But at the same time, the imperial conferences is it represents the end, not the beginning of imperial federation and the ideas towards that. And the Second World War crystallizes that. It destroys the idea of imperial federation. It pits the South Africans against the British, and they will elect the National Party in 1848. It makes the Americans, having the pervading influence in Canada. So again, from the German point of view, looking at this, it seems that it's the money bags who are determining these relations, and that imperial federation, if it's sought after, it's again done so without a necessary political will in order to achieve it, which again the Germans would ascribe to previous figures who were capable of being able to adopt Caesarism in earlier instances of British politics, like Lord Milner, the Round Table, and Cecil Rose. But on the topic of Lord Milner, the Round Table discussions, of course, and we were talking about Stanley Baldwin. Another famous figure is Philip Kerr, and Lord Halifax himself, it should be mentioned, that as the Germans are appealing towards the British and now have found themselves into this inexplicable position. Again, the irony of all of this is that despite all of these attempts to establish entente, all of this understanding, the notion of betrayal, this ethnic betrayal by the British in September of 1939, has actually completely consolidated aspects of the sort of ideological facets of National Socialism during this time, even though, as I mentioned, it was still a weak point where regime change throughout the war, up until, you can say, really 1944, seemed most possible during the Phoney War. It was a moment of consolidation. It was a means to allow Hitler to have that discretionary power when it came to essentially completing the goals and the military victories that we see in May and June of 1940. So, like I said, the Germans were pursuing entente, yet they were able to achieve their aims in opposition of the British, and yet they were prepared to, again, appeal to the British in October of 1939, when Poland had been occupied and basically the French hadn't done anything about it. So the Germans were again convinced, okay, well, you're not really fighting a war with us, are you? So we're going to make a peace claim. And then, if I remember correctly, Daladier and Chamberlain reject that. And then we fight them on the beaches in 1940. And Churchill is placed in a position of power so he can fight the war to the finish, with the aim of bringing the Soviets and the Americans into the conflict. And thereby we have the whole sort of raison d'etre that after the Phoney War, the whole basis of the war has changed. And from the German point of view, it's going to have to involve an ideological, again, betrayal in forming an alliance with the Soviet Union in order to crush the Germans, which again, in many ways, helps strengthen the animosity towards Britain. But it also gives rise to arguments that the British are becoming increasingly pawns of the Americans, which leads to the final reading segment that I have for today. But just on those specific aspects, do either of you have anything to comment?
Yes, it's interesting because you mentioned Philip Kerr there, Lord Lothian, because it's interesting because he's one of the biggest sort of advocates of like a rapprochement with Germany. I mean, not a full-blown alliance or anything, but at least because he had always felt the Versailles settlement with Germany had been too harsh, as well as many other members of the British elites, and so he wants to, try and help, create a conciliatory relationship with Germany as possible. However, obviously after the Munich Agreement, he actually ends up reading Mein Kampf for the first time, and he, from that point, kind of very much breaks with any kind of positive relationship with Germany. And then once the war breaks out, what happens? He's appointed as the ambassador to the United States, and that he would serve in that role until his death in December 1940. And other than Winston Churchill, there's no other person I think who was really responsible for the, he's actually the one who coins the term the special relationship, and and also one of his other accomplishments is is getting the deals such as the Destroyer for Bases agreement, and also getting the Lend-Lease Act passed, which is helping veer America more and more towards getting involved in the war.
In particular, the Destroyers for Bases is one of the most controversial aspects of the Second World War, because essentially Britain gained useless, not useless, but obsolete destroyers in return for basically conceding to the Americans the basis of what essentially is the strategic aspect of the American empire today, which are their military bases all across the world, in part at least. So I find it very interesting. But Philip Kerr again goes from this entente understanding towards Germany, and then becomes, part of this vehicle again towards the quote unquote special relationship with America. Because again, looking at this from a racial point of view, it seems to be that the same logic which is appealing to the notion of the fraternity of English speaking peoples is actually very similar to the same argument. Obviously, it follows exactly the same lines, that Britain should start appealing to their co-ethnics and their co-linguists in America, in the same way the Germans were trying to appeal to the northern German stock and the lower Saxons as appealing to the same sort of ethnic stock as the Britons. Indeed, another argument regarding that is that the trajectory of Britain was in realizing, you can say, the implications of the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, that any future of the British Empire would have involved civilizing the non-racial aspects of the empire, empowering the Indians, later empowering the Africans, that any future for the empire would be multiracial. And that actually, in following in this racial guise, if you're going to give up the empire, better to attach yourselves to your ethnic cohorts in the white dominion colonies in America and get rid of the empire. Effectively, that would be the basis of the special relationship, is actually a reactualization of part of that ethnic cohort, albeit instigated by the British for the sake of the Americans rather than the Germans for the sake of the British. It's just interesting to consider that. But on this notion, the German media occasionally satirized Britain's dependence on the United States. Das Reich marked the Lend-Lease Act with a cartoon about life in Buckingham Palace. It centered on a troubled night in which the king expresses fear that Churchill might trade me in for a ship or two. Again, that just sort of illustrates both your and my point quite succinctly. The leadership itself viewed the matter with the utmost gravity. In October of 1941, before Japan had entered the war, Hitler had made the following gloomy observation: were the empire to break apart now, it would have been due to our arms. Yet the Reich would not stand to gain. Russia would seize India, the Japanese the Far East, the Americans Canada, and I would be unable to prevent them from establishing themselves in the South Mediterranean. It was a disagreeable prospect. On the other hand, should the empire survive and perhaps founder at a later date, then the Third Reich might conceivably take part in the eventual bankruptcy auction. Those who suggested even today that Britain ought to have made peace in 1940 to preserve the empire for all time might care to reflect on the last thought. In the sense, he's referring to the fact that even if Britain had made peace, say, for example, at Halifax, become prime minister instead of Churchill, or had Churchill failed and Labour pull out of the National Unity government in, say, June of 1940, had he been able to form a coalition, a wartime coalition around him, then Germany would essentially have the means to seize control of British colonies in the future. That's certainly a very important point to consider. But again, it's an interesting notion, again, in terms of the flexibility of these alliances, that Hitler, from an ideological standpoint, from a racial standpoint, would far prefer to have an alliance with Britain than an alliance with Japan. And that the extension of having an alliance with Japan in the Far East and an alliance with Italy in the Mediterranean would mean that his non-ethnic cohorts would be able to carve out empires at the expense of the Anglo-Saxons. Again, from a purely racial point of view, it would seem completely incongruous, and he was aware of that. But nevertheless, part of his pragmatism in that regard was his willingness to make allies with the Japanese.
It is quite funny in that sense that neither the Japanese nor the Germans nor the Italians really had alliance with each other as their first not priority, can't think of the word, as their first desire, primary desire.
I think it's important to look at the tripartite pact as an alliance formed on hatred rather than any genuine affinity towards each other. The Italians, obviously, with their hatred of the British and wanting to, tear down the barriers of the Mediterranean, being the Suez Canal and Gibraltar, the Germans obviously feeling this sense of ethnic betrayal, and the Japanese wanting to establish a post-European hegemony over the East, both for racial reasons, but also for the primary purpose of establishing a resource zone in Southeast Asia at the expense of the Dutch and the British primarily, and also to establish complete control over China.
Yes, and on that hatred point, the feeling of being jilted by Britain.
Indeed, following a similar logic from Germany, actually, the Japanese, as Iron Duke in the chat will know, had an alliance with Britain up until the Washington naval conferences, and a lot of historians believe, and I would be part of them, that the shunning of the alliance with Britain causes a bit of an existential crisis for the Japanese over China, and precipitates a lot of action from below by the colonels to start seizing parts of Japan, parts of China, such as Manchuria in particular, which is really a coup of the colonels against the center.
Yeah, it really destabilizes internal Japanese politics, but that's probably a different conversation.
Yes, exactly. I think, again, what we're sort of an underlying sort of current here in terms of the German alliance delusion more generally is our frustration aimed at British foreign policy in the interwar periods, because in so many respects, whether it be the Far East in 1922, whether it be Abyssinia in 1936, or whether it be Poland in 1939, it seems Britain does everything within its power to create the worst possible conditions for the survival of its own national interests. And it's this inexplicableness of British foreign policy in so many fields that leads again to this sense of German sort of concreted self-actualization on an ideological front, despite the ethnic fraternity. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, no,
yes,
that's fair.
I would kind of add also that there's a certain amount of German self-sabotage as well in this regard, because as I was kind of trying to say earlier, there were certain constituencies that maybe could have been built into factions to actually create the possibility of some kind of alliance, as well as the fact that they do seem to have been early on trending in a direction that would make Germany not appear so deliberately combative towards British interests, and instead present themselves as a complementary power, or like for some sort of cooperation. But then they just shoot themselves in the foot in a bunch of ways by, among other things, pointing to very inappropriate people to the sort of most public-facing positions, and again just completely misunderstanding the ways that they would be able to build that constituency, which may otherwise exist. So there might have been something there in regards to mobilizing the lower classes towards some kind of national socialist or fascist type arrangement, the corporatist arrangement that would engender the fondness of the urban poor in the same way that Germany themselves had managed, but they failed to. Well, but that process fails partly possibly for reasons of Germany not doing anything to help, and partly just because of what Britain itself does with things like the British Union of Fascists. But they also kind of push themselves away from alliance with any particular grouping of aristocrats that might have existed who might have otherwise been sympathetic, because there still sort of was early on that cadre of more imperialist type figures who were trending in a more fascist sympathetic direction for quite a while. Baden-Powell comes to mind.
See, I'm very cynical of some of those aspects on three fronts. The first one I'll respond is the sort of Baden-Powell option. Most of the hardcore imperialists in the First World War were, I believe, the ones most responsible for getting us in that war in the first place, for the reason of detracting from the Irish issue and consolidating the colonies in one great heroic struggle against a conveniently placed enemy who had threatened our sea power, which was Germany, and that of course completely and utterly failed and backfired on us. The second point regarding the British Union of Fascists is that Oswald Mosley was always more sympathetic towards the Italians. So I believe the alienation of the Italian constituency actually has a lot more to do with that was, I believe, a front that could have been pursued, a Italian-British alliance, which actually would have been directed more against Germany and Austria. I don't believe Germany could have necessarily won that constituency of the fascists, which were Italian-lined more or less over to National Socialism. And then the third argument is that during the First World War. Well, before then, we had Prince Lichovsky, who was a very beloved ambassador by the English, to the point that he was actually, when he returned to Germany, he was given full honors as a returning diplomat. And yet, in spite of all of that, we still got involved in the First World War. So I think you could have, the most accomplished diplomat in the world, and you would still have the chance of the British foreign policy establishment rightly double guessing that whatever words you're telling us are not reflected in Berlin, which was the exact rationale that essentially doomed Lichovsky during the July crisis, that they believed there was a completely incongruous element between the foreign ambassador in London compared to the machinations that were going on with Bettmann Hollweg, von Moltke, and the Kaiser in Berlin.
Well, that's kind of where the more conciliatory posture comes to mind. So that even if you take a very strictly realpolitik and look only at capabilities, Germany is not positioned and not in the process of positioning themselves to be of a threat, regardless of what their intentions are at the end of the day.
But it was not simply the prospect of a premature division of the spoils among foreign powers that alarmed the Nazi leadership. What was particularly objectionable was that the United States should have become the heir presumptive of the British Empire. It was well known that Hitler and most of his paladins felt a lively distaste for America. This was moreover shared by a substantial number of their subjects, and was further reinforced, it seems, by actual encounters with Americans. When injured prisoners of war were exchanged in 1943, there was a high praise from the returnees for the British, who had been honourable and solicitous about their captives' welfare. There was later also a conspicuous praise for Canada, yet the Americans were described by those they had encountered them as brutal and rude. The thought that Britain was in the process of becoming an American colony, a Heligoland of the United States, was thus able to provoke genuine outrage in the Nazi leaders. What is indeed striking about the coverage of Anglo-American news in later years of the war is how little gloating there was about Britain's diminishing stature. The Third Reich might have been expected to take comfort in the thought that amid its general failure, it had at least succeeded in destroying the empire of its oldest enemy. There is no evidence of this. There were jibes about the relatively minor role the British Army had so far played in the war in Europe. It was described in 1943 as perhaps more rested than we are, but the characteristic Nazi gleefulness that had accompanied other nations' misfortune was largely absent with regards to Britain. Instead, there was barely disguised bafflement. How could the people of Britain not notice what was happening? Did they not see through the American machinations which were so shamelessly apparent? Britain would not be permitted to keep India. Every American pronouncement from the president to individual generals in the East pointed that way. By far the most obvious pronouncement, by the way, is actually the Atlantic Charter, the Atlantic Convention in August of 1941. Even before Pearl Harbor and the American receiving end of the declaration of war by Germany, there was the assumption that any American involvement in the war would essentially mean the end of the British Empire, which is ultimately what came to pass. And the whole basis of keeping India in the war then became independence after victory. The American Special Envoy Phillips, according to Des Reich, had described the Raj as immoral. Yet the paper noted, American revulsion for colonialism did not apparently extend to the Pacific, where the US was planning to expand its sphere of dominance, nor did it preclude US involvement in the Middle East, where it was seeking to control the region's oil wells, thus supplanting Britain in that region. He's referring to Iraq. American ideals, in other words, were linked with American self-interest. Did Britain not notice the palpable hypocrisy of its main ally? In a sense, however, the Nazi press admitted the United States was indeed Britain's natural heir. America was an adept, as the British Empire, at disguising national aggrandizement with moral rhetoric. These articles throughout 44 and 45 about potential Anglo-American conflict remain in part a mystery. Were they intended to persuade the German people that they should not abandon hope yet because their enemies were not united? If so, they failed noticeably in their purpose. That's referring to the course that German sort of anti-English propaganda would take later on in the war. that it was, thoroughly unpersuasive, essentially for the reasons of the natural sort of fraternity that the Germans still felt to the British even during that time, which again is still quite fascinating. That the feeling from the Germans as the war continues is, we do not celebrate but lament the destruction of the British Empire, and perhaps we recognize it more cogently than the British themselves do. It's quite bizarre in that sense, and why I was emphasizing the delusion has to be contextualized within a very sort of specific framework regarding Rassenkunde, and looking at this from the benefit of hindsight, because the English, in that sense, from the German point of view, were responsible for their own delusions with regards to the Americans. So yes, do either of you have anything to comment on that specific aspect?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that really should have been obvious, especially early on, that America was not going to be an ally like that. But in terms of, I don't know, it's kind of hard to justify in a sense, because like very, very early on, it would have become apparent. So even on the basis of the Washington naval treaties, one of the hopes and perhaps even assumptions was that there would be some amount of debt forgiveness in exchange for giving, in part for abandoning the Japanese alliance in favor of America, and then furthermore for agreeing to give America a peer status in the treaties themselves, insofar as that was a concession that they were able to give, but certainly would have been felt so at the time. And the fact that not only did not happen, but the Americans seem to have been even bewildered that would have been an expectation or a request, probably should have been an indication that it really didn't matter what Britain did in relation to the US. They were not going to relent on their expectations around things like decolonization.
And well, just before you come in, it's interesting. Maynard Keynes obviously was responsible for much of the excoriation regarding the Paris peace treaties, and for that reason, he actually earned some respect in Germany for his sympathy regarding that. But when it came to the end of the war, he tried to present the Americans with the case for justice, which of course would be a case for debt forgiveness. And of course, the American Congress would never accept what Maynard Keynes ever referred to as justice. But sorry, Bede, I interrupted you.
No, that's all right. Yeah, so ultimately, I think it's interesting that ultimately with the British and Americans, it's almost like, as you've alluded to, the Germans have this delusion towards an alliance with the British, whereas we have this delusion to an alliance with the Americans. And something I would say is, I think a real failure on our part was to put ourselves into a position of weakness and to submit ourselves before them, and seem to have this view that they wouldn't try and exploit it. And because a point to bring up is especially the financial control, because obviously during World War One, we stacked up a lot of debt to America because of the course of the war, and then obviously in the 1930s we decided to very wisely renege on that war debt, which obviously greatly pissed the Americans off. And then what do? You get yourself into another war and then go begging and saying, oh, we want to borrow money but we're broke, so here's all our gold reserves.
But again, it was a sort of interesting sort of thought to leave the conversation, because again, it's just the interesting sort of reciprocity that England is prepared to show to, because again, America is in some ways as ideologically incongruous as the Germans were. The main difference, I think, between the Germans and the Americans and their attitude toward the British is that the Germans admired the British Empire, whereas the Americans were content to see it destroyed. That's the main contention. And the fascinating thing, again, from the German point of view, why would the British surrender the empire to win the Americans as an ally when they could have kept it with an alliance with Germany?
There isn't really a good answer, I don't think.
But no, I think I just think that was quite a succinct way of explaining how completely baffled the Germans were.
Yeah, no, but it does almost like with a lot of these points that we've been making, especially in this sort of later section, talking about the failures of British foreign policy, it does kind of seem like so many of these decisions are just made almost in a vacuum without a greater strategy in some ways. I don't know. When you put them together, as you were saying before, it forms a somewhat puzzling picture that's hard to pass out, and maybe each one can be justified at each stage for unrelated reasons to one another or something, but put together it becomes completely bizarre.
Well, one thing I'll add is I did a stream with Semiagog just over a year ago on my channel about Carol Quigley's book, The Anglo-American Establishment, where he really delves into a lot of the ideas around the Rhodes Milner Group and the Rhodes scholarships and all of that. And one of the ideas of Cecil Rhodes was the idea of I want to reacquire the America for the British Commonwealth, and we're going to do it via stealth. We'll invite all these bright young Americans on Rhodes scholarships to study at Oxford. And there's a great quote from Quigley where he says the Milner Group had hoped that all of these American students would become indoctrinated and loyal to England, but all that happened is they became loyal to an idea of English liberty rather than the loyalty to England itself.
Well, even that idea sort of falls down a little bit, if only because they'd already been achieving that from a position of strength and relative antagonism with America, with groups like the Boston Brahmins and the general prestige that Britain had in America, especially in the Northeast for the longest time. And incidentally, that's what a lot of the Nordists were like. That's the kind of milieu that they were coming out of. So,
just to relate this back again to Germany, again, the point of view is even if that's the case, the same logic could have applied equally to the Germans. That's why I believe this argument isn't very convincing. Semigog I count as a friend, and he's been a long-time collaborator on this channel. But he and I disagree with this issue, because you can easily argue that had Britain again been interested in buttressing the empire and being able to effectively form a new basis of Nordic manpower to sustain the empire by stealth, then the British could have just equally leaned on the idea of the German alliance and allowed Hitler basically to prop up the British Empire by acting as that bulwark against the Soviet Union, and even threatening France, it should be mentioned, into giving potential concessions to the British Empire in future, and also strengthening the British position vis-a-vis the Americans. So the same logic can be used and applied exactly to Germany, but the British decided to resolutely attach themselves to the other power, which had already stated its objectives to destroy the British Empire. So I don't find it convincing for that exact reason. Would you agree with that, Bede?
That's fair.
So yes, anyway, I'm going to read the super chats, because he and I discussed this we're talking about the heartland theory in particular, and in the modern context, people use it as an argument really against Russia, but really it was an argument against Germany. The whole sort of rationale essentially is that Britain's European position was not only the paramount concern, but the only concern. If you're going to take that line of argument, then the American argument makes sense, that it is necessary to bring the Americans on board to act as a buttress to essentially defend the English homeland. That's the argument. Conversely, the German counter-argument to that is that you give a little on the home front, allow us to reconstruct the high seas fleet, and in return, we will buttress the empire. So it's a huge gamble either way. But obviously the British decided to give up the empire in order to shore up the home front from their point of view. Anyway, Gotskolk for 3,000 Icelandic krona. Thank you very much. Thank you for the live stream. Recent fan here. I was wondering if the need for nitrate for munitions pre-Harbour Process 1909 had a hand in the German naval program, i.e. guarantee access to global markets. Well, yes, that is an argument, but I think the issue again with the whole nature of the construct of I can't answer that question specifically because this isn't a German naval arms race question, and it's a very specific question, unfortunately, but I can answer it in general terms, which is that the lack of German naval bases across the world actually necessitated, again, a logic for a high seas fleet, which would again incur the animosity of Britain, unfortunately. Whereas had the Germans opted instead for a sort of global sort of convoy escort, cruiser destroyer fleet for the sake of its commercial interests, then the impetus again was building up a trade empire in East Asia, using sort of Tsingtao as the German Hong Kong in order to dominate trade with Japan and China and Polynesia, and maybe even encroach upon the Australian and New Zealand markets as well, which would have been quite interesting. But even if they had done that, even if the Germans had opted for that strategy, Pacific strategy over a high seas fleet strategy, from the point of view of German policymakers, that would have left Germany far more vulnerable in the North Sea to any preemptive British strike, which was their paramount concern if we're talking about the defense of the home front. And secondly, it would have still caused major antagonisms with the British if the Germans were seen to be trying to take away Australia and New Zealand as potential sort of markets away from the British. Obviously, that would have caused serious concerns.
I also can't speak specifically, but the German chemical industry is one of the major forces that stops that kind of thinking in other areas. So in particular around, I believe it was sulfur for the British dyeing industry that was completely bypassed by all the synthetic dyes that Germany was capable of creating. So I don't know for sure, but I have to imagine that they were kind of in the mode of thinking, well, if there's anything we don't have, then as previous experiences, anything to go by, we'll figure out a way eventually of being able to synthesize it through our chemicals industry, which is what they did for most other problems they had. So Germany, I would think, is uniquely in a position to probably not have that sense of urgency about acquiring some good from abroad.
Yes, unlike what we see in Japan, I think is the sort of contrast to that. I mean, had it not been, say, for example, for IG Farben, it's doubtful that the Germans would have been able to conduct the war in the way that they did.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and I think even America benefited from some of that, because didn't they take on a lot of the patents that existed for synthetic rubber, or did they develop those themselves? I can't remember.
I can't remember. I mean, there's a whole plethora of things that the Americans were able to inherit from the Germans. Obviously, the most notable one is Werner Braun and the German jet program and the German rocketry program, V1, V2, etc.
Oh, of course, after the war, but even after the outbreak of the war, they took over all of the subsidiaries and the patents at the start of the war, and through the course of the war, they were able to benefit from those.
Mm. Another interesting point in World War One was obviously seizing control of all of Germany's magnificent cruise liners as well. Basically, the whole American cruise line industry was actually built on the stolen German ones, but there we are. Rong Tao Wu for $10. Thank you very much. The French seem to have gotten almost everything they wanted post-World War One, but suffered a massive collapse of morale and gave up their proxies. The Little Entente never amounted to much. I would disagree with that in the 1920s. I mean, the whole basis of the Little Entente was actually quite impressive when you think about it. Romania had a larger army throughout the 1920s than Germany had. Czechoslovakia had an army which rivaled Germany's. I can't remember exactly if it was larger than Germany's. Hungary was completely and utterly dismantled. Hungary suffered more than any of the quote-unquote belligerent powers, despite it being, brought into the war mainly by the Austrian German general staff against its will, because of the necessities of building up the Little Entente. So, no, the French, had they decided to invest more into that alliance, would have done very well out of it. It's part of the reason why de Gaulle had developed such a sort of theoretical disdain for many of the French elites, even Pétain, it should be mentioned at the end, because they were unwilling to invest and focus their strengths on Germany. Effectively, you can see a contradiction arising in French thought, which is, you can say, the belated realization that they should have been treated Germany better in the first place. That was part of the rationale for the Locarno Pact, which allowed for Germany to recognize France's gains without being in a position of duress. But before then, the French had occupied the Ruhr in order to seize back reparations. Had the French made far more overtures earlier on in the 1920s, it's possible that the German political situation would have changed. So, for example, in 1930, as a way, in many ways, to prop up Heinrich Brüning as the Weimar Republic was unraveling. Heinrich Brüning was there by the volition of von Hindenburg. He was not there by result of popular mandate. The French withdrew from the Rhineland, which they had previously occupied, and left it prematurely. But that meant when the Heinrich Brüning government collapsed, and later Franz von Papen and von Schleicher come in, and then Hitler comes in, the French have lost that forward position against the Germans. So again, too little, too late. And by then, the French have gone through the Great Depression. They were not willing to invest in their alliances. And like I said, from the point of view of the French, the Czechoslovak question is the most inexplicable act of cowardice on the part of the French, because the destruction of Czechoslovakia essentially undoes so much of the gains made by France, perhaps even more so than the Anschluss, which allows Germany economically and demographically to really overtake the French in the 1930s. So yes, in many ways they got so much out of World War One, but the Little Entente would have served as that buttress, not just against Germany, but more so against the Soviet Union. Romania had expanded at the expense of Russia into Bessarabia in modern-day Moldova and Ukraine. So it's very significant that Romania ended up switching sides and becoming a German satellite at the end. Anyway, JBDC for $5, thank you very much. Can't help, must see parallel between mad evil dictator trope aimed at Wilhelm and the modern approach towards Putin. Must go watch rest later. Well, yes, I mean, Wilhelm was shown, what was it, feasting on Belgian babies and things like that, and the Germans, bayoneting children in Belgium and things like that. And yeah, a lot of the sort of, and obviously this is after Hun's speech. So a lot of, you can say, the caricatured archetypes for the leader who is an enemy of democracy, who we need to invade and bring peace, justice, and truth, and all that sort of thing, all those good American things, over to every span of the world. You can say it really begins with Wilhelm, and I think the issue is, again, Wilhelm's appalling lack of tact when it came to diplomacy, which engendered that sort of opinion. I mean, the Daily Telegraph affair vis-a-vis the Entente is perhaps the most visible example of that. And like all the dictator tropes, there have been many attempts to try and reason his politics by a way of psychoanalysis. So, yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah, seeing so many of the same tropes come out over and over again does make me suspicious. I mean, more recently, it's a lot of the same kinds of stories that come out, which yeah, I tend not to give them too much credence when I see some of those. But I mean, I might argue that it goes back even further. I mean, maybe this is stretching a little bit, but it seems like it goes.
Napoleon seems to be the one that really, it's sort of the punch cartoon version of foreign relations. Boney the ogre, the great thief of Europe, the monster. I would say Bonaparte is really the one who exemplifies this trope, but I would say perhaps setting the trend for modern quote-unquote dictators within, the sense of essentially of bringing Wilsonian liberal democracy. I think it begins with the Kaiser, and why the Kaiser was such an impediment to any peace settlement with the West.
Yeah, that's the main, most recent sort of clearest, the way that we have the mold now. But it seems to me that if you that again, perhaps stretching it a little bit, goes back to Louis XIV, the treatment of Louis XIV by British sources in the press and such.
Yes, I think in that particular reference, it's the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, the Edict of Fontainebleau. And I think, yes, you're correct. The sort of after effects of that did much to destroy James II's reputation by proxy. James II, for reference, was a Catholic king, and the revocation of the Edict of Nantes was forcing Huguenots, French Protestants, to go into exile. That's an interesting idea. Maybe maybe Leo X and the papacy was the first object as the whore of Babylon. maybe that's a good contender for this. It all begins with the Pope. Maybe even goes before then. But anyway, I think it's, if I'm going to be metaphysical about it, I think it's just the Christ Antichrist trope, which comes to the fore in history. It's simply when we look at figures like Bonaparte and to a greater extent with Wilhelm, it becomes secularized. These archetypes exist throughout history. It's the same with you go even before the Antichrist. Go to the Epic of Gilgamesh, slaying a dragon, Siegfried slaying Fafnir. All of these things are just represent the hero's journey and primordial aspects of legends and cosmology. It's always the slaying of the beast, the slaying of the giant, the slaying of the dragon, the slaying of Medusa. The examples can go on. The slaying of the Minotaur. I don't need to. The difference is when talking about figures like Louis XIV and Bonaparte is that these have become humans and no longer mythical creatures, but of course the caricatured in the way that they become mythical creatures. Do you think it's fair to say?
Yeah, again, that's probably stressing it even more. But I was thinking more strictly in the sense of an Eastern-style despot, or like an Oriental despot who has designs on world domination. Which Rong Tai Wu in the chat makes a good point about the probably the earliest of Xerxes and Darius.
Xerxes and yes, Battle of Marathon and Battle of Thermopylae. And regarding that Oriental archetype in the more recent history, referring back to Wilhelm II, is his unfortunate association with the Bloody Sultan, as you're very well aware of, Bede, Abdulhamid II. So yes, you could be more granular, but I think in the sense of, I hate to say it, but forming the modern world, I think Wilhelm and the vilification of the Germans in World War I was the sort of beginning of the sort of, I don't know, the sort of proto-neocon project that we see in its modern sense. I think it was also necessary due to the fact that so many of the Entente powers were willing to obfuscate for the fact that they were technically allied with the Red Tsar, which again press had done so much to vilify during the 1905 revolution in Russia.
Also, as we've talked so much about racial theories, there's also another curious element of it, which is that it usually comes alongside an attempt to distance the power in question from whiteness. So in the case of modern Russia, it's trying to claim significant amounts of Asian influence, both genetic and otherwise. And in the case of Germany, they were trying to make a case about the Huns having a
indeed,
a very outsized influence and all the Asiatic connotations there.
Well, again, it's ironic. I mean, Strobl mentions at the beginning, and I expanded upon his point by bringing in Tolkien, but it's the idea that Theodor Rex, Theoden King, is that Anglo-Saxon pan-Germanic example of heroism against the great Oriental beast. But here the trope has been completely inverted, and that moment of an inception of fraternity has instead been recast of England as Theoden, and this would also mean Tolkien as well. It should be mentioned. The Hun is now the German, ironically. And the Anglo-Saxon has in many ways been liberated from that association by the recasting of Wilhelm I as Attila. But on your broader point about the Oriental notions of the dictator and trying to de-Europeanize enemies of the West, one of the most cynical things to justify what we've been at length to try and understand, which is Britain's position towards Poland in 1939, is that a strict legalistic reading of the guarantee was to essentially preserve Poland against European aggression. And so the way that interpreters of the guarantee tried to get out of declaring war on the Soviet Union for the same reason was to say that the Soviet Union was not a European power.
But of course, I didn't actually know that.
So yes, you're right that the Oriental trope can be applied in so many different ways whenever it's convenient. All right. Lord Charles Thomas for €5 had to depart early, just a donation. Well, thank you very much. All right. We're coming close to 4 hours. I'll ask you first, Bede. Anything you would like to say or promote before we leave?
Well, thank you so much for having me on AM. It's been a great discussion. Yes, in terms of my channel, yesterday I had Furious Pertinax on to talk about the early campaigns of Belisarius, so from his rise as a garden to Justinian, and we ended with the Vandalic War, and at some point next month we'll carry on and go into the Gothic War. Other than that, the main thing I'm working on my channel is a series on modern Iran with my good friend Hunger, and so the next episode of that should be, I believe, in about just under 2 weeks' time. We'll be looking at Iran during World War One, and that's about it. Thank you.
Sounds good. And thank you for joining me for this discussion. Same question to you, Rupert.
Same things as ever in my case. I'm involved with Pendragon. Worth going having a look at what they're doing, trying to restore castles. But also, I had hoped to finally get my next video out this weekend, but illness has laid me low. So hopefully in the next week, and then I can get back on track with talking about Greek monarchy again.
Yes, you performed very well in spite of your what you've been sullied with. So thank you so much for sort of bearing with us throughout this conversation. You've been great.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Yeah, I'm doing a thing on this channel where it really is a case of I'm almost doing, a stream for me and then a more, a popular, controversial topic. And just looking at the viewing figures for this has proved that. If anything, I want to encourage more people to go back and listen to sort of the Intrusible Chamber, because that's sort of my passion at the moment. But nevertheless, for this conversation, I just want to credit the sources, in particular Dr. Gerwin Strobl and his Germanic Isle. It really is, especially in English, there isn't really any book out there like it. So I was very grateful to have that resource, because I'm very much obviously we've been looking at it from both the cultural and the foreign policy and political angle of it for this evening. But I'm always gravitating more towards conceptual and cultural histories. The previous conversation I did 2 days ago on Christopher Dawson being one such example, another historian I'd like to promote. All right. Thank you everyone for listening, and good night.
Good night.